Episode 36. Bullying. Scarlett! Bessy stepped forward, but Scarlett avoided her and looked straight at Grace. But Auntie, Bessy didn't do anything wrong. She only helped me teach those scums a lesson. She did nothing wrong and doesn't need to apologize to anyone. Scarlett's glasses had been taken away by Stephen long ago, so her dark eyes were revealed, clear and calm. The parents of those teenagers froze and reacted quickly. What nonsense! This girl is shameless! Grandma Williams simply wanted to rush up and tear Scarlett's mouth off her face. What do you mean? My grandson isn't like that! There's a CCTV at the intersection of that bookstore, and he has a criminal record at Fairfield from 3 years ago. Scarlett ignored them, turning to look at the police and whispered, "You can investigate and see if it's true. I'm thrilled that this time you've publicized it. Officer, you still haven't told me yet. Just what crime is it?" She spoke calmly, with her back straight and tall. Officer Reynolds almost burned himself with the cigarette in his hand. He looked at Scarlett, stunned, before saying slowly, "If it's a light punishment, a few months. If it's a heavy punishment, then 3 to 5 years. For some reason, the parents who had just been shouting and the aggressive Grandma Williams suddenly lost their ability to speak. A police officer holding a notebook noted it down and watched Grandma Williams and the others. His gaze changed instantly, and he frowned. Grandma Williams and the others stood rooted to the ground, their faces ashen and a little awkward. Officer Reynolds' words struck panic in their hearts. Thomas's dressing style wasn't ordinary, and it was obvious that his family was rich. They had wanted to publicize this matter only to get more compensation for their sons. But after hearing Scarlett's words, they looked at each other and were a little afraid. The girl was the victim, and according to the police officer, their sons would have to go to jail and would even have a record taken down. Thomas, who had been staring blankly at them, finally returned to his senses. He had always been agile when dealing with interpersonal relationships and most things, so now he responded faster than Grace and Anne. "Police officer, send someone to investigate and monitor the CCTV first. Oh, and the case at Fairfield also needs to be investigated," he said while taking 2 steps forward and lowering his head to look at Bessy. She had her hand in her pocket and her fringe over her face so that her expression couldn't be seen. But it seemed like her face had become paler. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked in a low voice, his tone gentle. He had just learned that Bessy had fought alone with a dozen boys. Girls naturally had poorer physical fitness than boys. No. Bessy was stunned for a while after hearing Thomas's voice. She looked away and shook her head, leaning against the wall with her long eyelashes hanging down. Her mood appeared to be terrible. It was like a barrel of oil, where a trace of fire could light it up. On one side, Grace and Anne finally reacted. After Thomas explained to the police and asked Bessy again, his eyes turned to Grace and Anne. He pursed his lips. "Aunt, I think you should be more affectionate and trusting towards your own child. It's not right to only listen to the outsider's side of the story, don't you think?" Anne listened to him beside Grace and dug her fingernails into her palm. Who knew that the situation would become like this? The parents didn't say a word, and the police began to re-inquire about the records. With Thomas there, they went to check the CCTV as well. It was late now, so Thomas helped Bessy and Scarlett through the formalities, and they were soon both released. The aggressive Grandma Williams was speechless now, and she just stood there, constantly looking out the door, deep in her own thoughts. Deputy Brown received a phone call. He rushed and finally arrived. Stephen's father was at the hospital to see him, so he wasn't there. "Deputy Brown." The police officer who was taking down notes stood up to say hello. Grandma Williams' sluggish spirit was refreshed immediately after seeing Deputy Brown. She took 2 steps forward and said, "Deputy Brown, you came at the right time. This person injured my grandson and mustn't be tolerated." "Old lady, sit down first. I will handle this matter." Deputy Brown helped her to the side. "I'm assured now that you are here. They were trying to scare me, and I can't stand it." Grandma Williams deliberately left out information about Scarlett and only focused on how Bessy had injured them.
I just answered Principal White's phone call. Your grandson is disabled, so I will definitely give you an account.
Deputy Brown's attitude was clear.
Deputy Brown, Stephen was the one who attempted violence in this incident.
Thomas saw Deputy Brown and said calmly, his brows furrowed. Deputy Brown tilted his head and was slightly shocked to see Thomas.
Oh, it turns out to be Mr. Smith. I know about the incident. Young people can fight and the other party can perform self-defense, but now Stephen is the one lying in the hospital. What are you doing?
Seeing the list in the hand of the police, Deputy Brown frowned.
This matter hasn't been fully investigated yet. How could you let them go? Wait till Stephen wakes up tomorrow and gives a confession statement.
Deputy Brown, what do you mean? Thomas smiled slightly.
There are still some pieces of evidence that haven't arrived yet. We have to do things fairly, don't you agree?
Deputy Brown was showing off his strength now. He acted impartially and reasonably, so not even the slightest mistake could be pointed out. He controlled the situation first before talking about private affairs tomorrow. The people at the police station respected Deputy Brown. Although they were cynical of Grandma Williams' actions, they were still orderly and listened to his orders.
Thomas, who is that?
Grace looked at Thomas in panic.
This is Chicago's Deputy Brown.
Thomas frowned.
The Smith family has no relationship with him. I'll ask Aunt if she knows anyone from the police department.
Even if Bessy had the right intentions, it would be difficult for her to go back tonight if they didn't receive a release statement.
Bring me all those people first.
Deputy Brown wanted to keep an eye on Bessy and the other youngsters.
Deputy Brown?
Grace had always been cautious because of her family problems. At this moment, when she heard that he was some deputy, she started to panic. Furthermore, Thomas felt it would be difficult to handle matters since the deputy was involved.
Then let's go back first.
Grace reached out and anxiously wanted to pull Thomas. Thomas was worried about Bessy being alone in the police station.
I'll go back and find my dad and aunt first.
Thomas looked at Bessy, paused, and comforted her.
You can rest assured.
Knock, knock. It was then that someone knocked on the doorframe twice. The knock was very sudden. Everyone looked in the direction subconsciously. Grandma Williams was sitting on a stool and holding tea. Since she had a supporter now, she was relaxed and raised her eyebrows to glance at Bessy and the rest sideways. When she heard the sound, she turned her head as well. She saw the young police officer at first glance. Excuse me, who is Miss Bessy? The police officer glanced through the crowd and finally fixed her eyes on the girl wearing the jacket of Brightbow High School. The girl had her face turned away, but her beautiful outline could still be seen. Her skin was very white and she wore her school jacket properly. It was open and her white shirt inside was stained with a few drops of blood, making thin outlines. With so many people in the crowd, this girl was the most eye-catching, so the police officer's eyes fell on her face subconsciously. It wasn't until the girl raised her eyes slightly and looked at her inquiringly that the police officer realized that she was Bessy. Miss Miller, Director Soup has invited you to the lounge. The police officer bowed slightly. Please follow me. Bessy paused, one hand still in her pocket. She tilted her head slightly and narrowed her eyes, wondering who was looking for her. Out of the people she was familiar with, there didn't seem to be anyone with the surname Soup. Thomas gave her a questioning look. Bessy raised her chin and said casually, "It's okay. I'll take a look." She went out the door. Rick Soup had been exiled from the capital, and if placed in ancient times, he was suitable for an imperial envoy equivalent to a special envoy. He directly represented the highest oligarchy here. Deputy Brown definitely knew him, but he didn't know that the Director Soup the police officer was talking about was the same Rick that he knew. He watched as Bessy followed the police officer and passed by him directly towards the lounge. Deputy Brown was very surprised. He couldn't help but look at Bessy, who had already left. He asked the police officer politely,
"This Director Soup is—"
The police officer glanced at him and without speaking, turned and left. In the lounge. Rick was nearly 40 years old, but he was well maintained and looked as if he was in his early 30s. The years left no trace on him. He sat in a chair, reached out and poured 2 cups of tea. He glanced at the tall and slender figure standing by the door and chuckled.
Come, sit here and drink tea. I've already sent someone to investigate it. You were so anxious that I thought something had happened.
Michael's business couldn't be delayed. Who knew that after rushing here, it turned out to be a dispute between high school students? Marvin sat aside and nodded madly in his heart. It was true, wasn't it? This matter could have been settled with a phone call, but he just had to bring Rick here. How many matters had been delayed because of this? In ancient times, their Mr. Clark was simply an incapable ruler. Samuel touched his ear studs and tilted his head.
Uncle Rick, she's not here yet? What's the rush?
Rick was curious at this moment. What kind of little girl could make these 2 people so anxious? 2 figures could be seen outside the window. Rick picked up the teacup and calmly said,
Look, isn't she here already?
After that, his eyes didn't shift away. Michael's expression was indifferent. His eyes were half squinted and he had his hands around his chest, leaning lazily against the doorframe with his slender figure. The familiar figure appeared. Michael stood straight subconsciously and his eyes fell on her. The little girl followed behind a police officer with her head lowered slightly. She walked over slowly, her jacket loose and making her seem even skinnier and weaker. Her open jacket revealed her white shirt inside. There were bloodstains. Michael was very sensitive to the 5 senses, and before she even came in, he could detect the strong, bloody smell. He leaned against the door, looked at her for a few seconds, and then said with a cold expression,
Right hand.
As soon as Bessy looked up, she saw Michael standing by the door and looking at her. She pursed her lips and glanced at him, then slowly drew the hand from her pocket. After interacting with so many people, none of them had even noticed a problem with her hand. Samuel saw that Bessy was here and was slightly relieved. But the next second, he saw Bessy's hand come out of her pocket and his face suddenly turned pale.
Bessy, what is this?
He yelled in shock. Episode 37. Who Gave You the Courage? The girl's hands were thin and her nails were clean and moist. Samuel had told Michael more than once that it was the hands of a pianist. The hand was stained with scarlet blood. Some parts were dried while other parts were still dripping. Michael looked down, lowered his head and gently opened her fingers with his hands. The 2 wounds stretched across the palm of her hand. The wounds were very narrow and blood was still leaking out. Michael was a doctor, so how could he not know how deep the wound was? He looked at the hand for a while, his pupils turning dark.
Marvin, drive the car over.
The wound looked terrible. Marvin glanced at it, his wooden face indifferent, but his lips pursed inadvertently. He went to get the car in silence. Samuel returned to his senses and stared at the startling wound. He stood up suddenly.
What's going on?
Rick had been with the 2 of them for so long, yet in so many years he had never seen Michael so angry before. He couldn't even bear to look at him straight. He sat up straight inadvertently and glanced at the director, who was sitting on the side, the teacup on the table. A beep sound. As soon as the director returned home, the police officer called him almost immediately. Director Soup was coming to inspect their bureau. He didn't know Michael and Samuel, but he knew Rick. Seeing how polite Rick was to Michael, he dropped his teacup and his heart leaped to his throat.
What's the matter? You guys even carried private punishments.
He immediately tilted his head and asked the police officer. Rick was handed the confession from the police officer, who repeated the situation. The lounge was silent. No one spoke except him. The police officer's voice gradually became softer. Marvin was still not back with the car. Samuel was accustomed to domineering in Evanston, and Bessy had been drawn into his circle.
Ha!
A chuckle. The police officer felt goosebumps. He looked up cautiously.
We'll settle it publicly and privately, tisk.
Samuel yanked his collar. His eyes were cold as he walked outside, tilting his head and motioning to a police officer.
Where are they?
Nobody in the entire city dared to say this in front of Mr. Clark before. Office Hall in the Bureau. Bessy's departure had been abrupt, and Deputy Brown's heart was not calm. Anne pursed her lips and watched as Thomas returned from his phone call. She whispered, "Mother, brother, shall we go back first? Aunt is still waiting for us." Grace was now extremely anxious. She didn't speak and just looked at Thomas. Thomas glanced in the direction Bessy was taken away. He paused for a long while before looking down at his phone. "Jacob just gave me the captain's phone number. I'll find Aunt first. She should have some connections." These things couldn't be explained in a few simple words, so Thomas couldn't help much by staying here either. He prepared to talk to Elise deeper into the issue. Grace and Anne followed closely behind him. Thomas noticed her and pursed his lips.
"Aunt, aren't you staying?"
Bessy was still at the police station, and the conclusion hadn't been drawn yet. Impatient and annoyed, she stood where she was and said,
"I'll wait for the matter to be settled. Drive carefully."
Anne followed Thomas into the car. Coincidentally, a black car drove out of the garage with a Volkswagen brand on the outside. It took people's gaze with it. Anne didn't seem to care about this car much, but Thomas's footsteps paused when he saw it. "Brother, what's wrong?" Anne glanced at him. Thomas stared at the license plate, then shook his head after a while.
"It's nothing. Let's go."
This was Evanston's license plate number, but now that Bessy's affair was pressing, Thomas thought little of it and hurriedly turned to pick up the car. Grandma Williams had not realized the tension of the matter. Ever since Deputy Brown came, she had calmed down and did not know what kind of person she had provoked. She didn't see that Deputy Brown was drinking tea now, suppressing the uneasiness in his heart. Grandma Williams took the opportunity to talk to Deputy Brown about Bessy and the Smith family.
"Stephen might have indeed made a mistake, so it's not too helpful to him if we publicize this matter."
Deputy Brown was slightly relieved. He lowered his head and said to Grandma Williams,
"I was just testing this little girl just now and scaring them. We will settle it privately. Stephen is so severely injured, the compensation fee must be heavy too."
Grandma Williams nodded. The moment Scarlett had spoken, she knew she couldn't publicize this.
"I'll pay as much as you want."
Grace looked at her sharply and pondered openly.
"The children can't possibly stay at the police station at night."
Grace only had one request now. She mustn't let Bessy leave a criminal record behind. She laughed with a stiff face and didn't dare to say anything. Seeing how scared Grace genuinely was, Grandma Williams and Deputy Brown relaxed a little. The Smith family was also notorious in Chicago, and many people knew that Grace was the second wife. They also knew that David Smith's second wife was from a small family and couldn't afford to make much trouble. As for Bessy, she was just a student, and they didn't need to worry about her.
"If you want to pay the compensation, follow the rules."
Grandma Williams was mean by nature and always spoke while glaring at others.
"I know."
Grace thought about it, picked up her cell phone and went outside to ask her lawyer. After Grace went out, Grandma Williams put down her teacup, wiped her mouth with a paper towel and smirked.
"The light of fireflies."
But she didn't finish her sentence. Deputy Brown's cell phone rang. He took out his phone and looked at it, shocked.
"Chief?"
The person on the other end said something that caused Deputy Brown to jump up from his chair immediately, the veins on his forehead bulging.
Yes, I understand."
In just a few words of dialogue, Deputy Brown's spirit was a bit sluggish.
"Deputy Brown, what's wrong?"
Grandma Williams held her teacup and took a sip of tea. Deputy Brown rearranged his clothes nervously, his eyes obscure.
"It's the chief."
He had just walked to the door of the office hall and was facing a few people. The chief was still wearing his home clothes, as if he had rushed here in a hurry and hadn't had time to change his clothes. The police were very familiar with him, but the chief was obviously one step behind the young man beside him, as if he were following the young man. The police in the hall stood up immediately and called out,
"Chief!"
The other people also looked at him. This was the chief? They couldn't help but look at the person beside him. Who was this man that made the chief walk one step behind him? The young man's eyebrows were down, and his fingertips pinched a freshly lit cigarette. He walked forward and then paused, looking at the house full of people, and then laughed.
There are a lot of people here, eh?
He looked around and saw the girl in the corner. The girl had her head down, her short hair tied softly, and she seemed to be holding a cell phone. She seemed to be deep in thought, and a female officer was beside her.
Mr. Bright,
the chief said carefully. Samuel turned his head, glanced in Grandma Williams' direction, and then at the squatting teenagers in the room.
You're Bessy's classmate, right? Come here. I'll take you to find her.
Subconsciously, Samuel lightened his voice.
Chief, let's settle this privately first, then publicize it.
Samuel could settle this small matter with a few simple words. He really used his identity to compete with them and pressurize them.
I'll take them back first. My lawyer will come soon. I hope I won't see similar things happening in the future.
The chief wiped the cold sweat on his forehead.
I understand, Mr. Bright.
He sent them to the door. The chief's voice was so low that nobody dared to even speak in the originally noisy hall.
Who?
The people in the hall dared to breathe now. When Samuel had left with Scarlett, Grandma Williams responded.
Deputy Brown, what is going on? Who is that person?
Deputy Brown also whispered.
The chief.
The chief watched as Samuel left. This time he turned sideways and looked at Deputy Brown for a long while before finally shaking his head.
It's better if this matter is settled privately. If you are lucky, this matter can be resolved peacefully.
Then what about the compensation?
Grandma Williams had planned it to be settled privately, so she didn't care too much about it.
You still want them to compensate for the loss? If your family can make them settle it privately, it's already considered a once-in-a-lifetime stroke of luck. They want to publicize it eventually. Deputy Brown, are you muddle-headed? Who gave you the courage to try to bring Director Soup into this, huh?
Deputy Brown's legs went weak at his words and his palms started sweating.
Director Soup?
The chief shook his head and called Officer Reynolds out for a detailed inquiry. Grandma Williams noticed that something was wrong. She squeezed her hands and stared at Deputy Brown with turbid eyes.
Deputy Brown, I didn't hear clearly just now. Who was the chief talking about?
Director Soup. Rick Soup. The one reported daily by Chicago Evening News. You have really done me harm this time.
Deputy Brown wiped his face and stared at her. Then he immediately chased after the chief. He had really kicked the iron plate this time. He had a good relationship with Stephen Williams' father, and had thought that this was just a small tension between high school students, so he had come to help out. Who knew that even Rick Soup was involved? Now he could barely protect himself. Grace just called the lawyer. She had yet to see Stephen Williams' injury report, so she just talked about it briefly. If she wanted to settle it privately, she would have to compensate about $400,000. This was a small sum of money for the Smith family, but David had the details of Grace's card records. Grace walked inside the police station while pressing her temple. Mrs. Smith. The policewoman came forward politely. Her attitude was so good that it was a little strange. Grace looked up. My daughter. Oh, the chief is dealing with this matter now. The policewoman took her pen and lowered her head to write her notes. Your daughter has already left the police station. As for Stephen Williams, we've already sent people to transfer Fairfield's files, and we will also bring people there to question him. When the section chief politely sent her out, Grace had not fully figured out what was going on. The chief was dealing with this matter? What did this have to do with the chief? She didn't even know who the chief was. Episode 38. Kick the Iron Plate. The school's medical office had incomplete tools, so Marvin drove the car directly to the hospital. Michael had a temporary sterilization box in his car, but didn't have other tools, so he could only help her disinfect it and handled it slightly. The lights in the back seat were on. It was because either Marvin's driving was stable or because the car was performing well, but the journey was smooth and had no bumps. Michael lowered his eyes and wrapped the bandages thinly. He swept disinfected water across her 2 wounds gently. Because Bessy's skin was so white, the contrast of the bright red was even more obvious. His heart ached and tightened at the sound. He paused, cleared his throat, and looked up.
You...
He saw Bessy holding the window in her left hand, leaning lazily on the backrest with her head tilted. She was looking out the window, and the light cast a shadow under her dark eyes. Her eyes were narrowed slightly, and when he looked closely, it seemed absent-minded and slightly cynical. Bessy didn't move her hand. She slightly tilted her head and opened her mouth slowly. What? Her eyes were clear and her expression was plain, as if she didn't have 2 wounds on her hand. He swallowed the phrase,
"If it hurts, tell me,"
back into his throat. Michael stared into her eyes and couldn't look away from those eyes filled with a sea of stars. They arrived at the hospital soon. In the evening, the doctor was ready to help her with the stitches. Michael held a cell phone against the wall and talked with Samuel.
"It's good to be 18,
Michael said, his eyes falling heavily on the door. He had a lit cigarette between his fingertips, and his expression was still lazy, but his words were cool.
All the responsibilities can be taken.
The stitches on Bessy's hand were sewn, and the anesthesia would wear off soon. Michael kept the phone and subconsciously wanted to get rid of the cigarette. Don't avoid me. Bessy thought for a moment, then tilted her head and leaned against the wall. She looked into his eyes and smiled. Give me one? Her voice was light. Michael stumped his cigarette without changing his expression and threw it into the trash. He also threw away the cigarettes in his pocket. Bessy didn't mind. She just shrugged and said, "Thank you for today. You can deduct the expenses from my pay." Michael looked at her back as she walked in front of him, pressed his temple with his fingers, and stood there for a long while. Over here. Grace returned to the Smith family's house. David was sitting in the lobby. Thomas hung up his phone and saw that she was back.
"Aunt, why are you back? How is Bessy?"
Anne heard the voices and put down her violin. "Aunt, Mother seems to be back. Shall we go down and take a look?" She led Elise downstairs. Grace was still thinking about the chief. She had called Bessy, but she didn't pick up. Now that she saw Elise, she suddenly didn't know how to speak. She pursed her lips and didn't speak. "What's the matter? Making the whole family so restless. Thomas and my brother have been looking for people the whole night." Elise took a sip of tea and glanced at Grace. "This matter isn't so simple." Thomas shook his head.
"Deputy Brown intervened. Aunt, is there anyone you know at the police station?"
Elise put the teacup on the table and said nothing. "Aunt, please help my sister. She's still detained at the police station." Anne shook Elise's arm. "Detained at the police station?" Elise glanced at Grace until Grace was too embarrassed and looked back. "You are ridiculous. I know a few people. I can find them tomorrow." Grace was relieved. The Smith family really couldn't find a few acquaintances, so it was good Elise offered to help.
"Thomas, do you know their chief?"
Grace asked Thomas. "Ha!" Elise laughed. "Brother Thomas, I'll go to bed first." Grace sat on the sofa, on her pins and needles. Thomas explained.
"Our Smith family is only a merchant."
After all, the Smith family had a very weak foundation. That was why it was strange. Grace smiled awkwardly. She didn't know much about such things, but she frowned. What did that policewoman mean? Could it be that Bessy or Scarlett knew him? The next day, early in the morning, the sound of classroom exercises in the dormitory building kept sounding. Bessy had already asked for leave, but the noise was still unbearable. She got out of bed irritably. Her eyes were bloodshot. Yesterday, Samuel had taken the school jacket to the dry cleaners, and she had taken a thin black jacket on the way. At this moment, it was time for official exercises, but Brightbow High School rarely had drills, and the lesson period was long, so the students all went out to buy snacks. People came and went. Bessy had her head lowered slightly and was dressed neatly in her school jacket. She half squinted her almond eyes and frowned slightly. In the past 2 days, Paul had paid little attention to Anne. Anne had felt it, but she pretended it was nothing. He went downstairs with Kenneth to buy lollipops, and Anne went with them to discuss a few questions with Kenneth in a low voice. Most of the people's eyes were on them along the way. Paul put one hand in his pocket, and there were a few younger students following him.
"Bessy took leave today?"
He peeled a lollipop and stuffed it into his mouth, and then tilted his head and asked Kenneth. Kenneth was today's discipline leader. Kenneth was cold. He paused, then shook his head.
I don't know.
Anne stood aside and froze. Don't you guys know?
What?
About my sister? Anne pursed her lips, then shook her head and played with her fingers. She committed a crime, so she's still at the police station. No one spoke for a while. Anne's voice wasn't low. Several people around Paul heard it and looked at each other. The people passing by also went over to listen. What happened? Anne, how do you know?
Oh my God, she got locked up. What crime did she commit for her to be locked up?
Anne was a popular figure in the school, especially during this period. Her limelight covered Paul and others. Everyone surrounded her. Being locked in a police station was not a trivial matter. According to the development of this situation, it would take less than an afternoon for the news to be passed throughout the school. Anne walked on the right side of Paul, closest to the side of the road, and Paul had stopped moving the lollipop around in his mouth. He pushed it to the side, looked at Anne and frowned.
What happened?
It's a criminal case, said Anne ambiguously. She felt the eyes of the people around her and whispered, I think she won't be able to come out for a while. Please stop asking me. I don't want to talk about it. Before she could finish talking, an empty water bottle suddenly hit her. Bang! There was a loud noise, and it slammed into a tree a few steps away and bounced to her feet again. People who were still gossiping looked in the direction the water bottle came from. Bessy was standing a dozen meters away with one hand in her pocket. Ignoring everyone, she looked straight ahead and walked forward. She frowned. It seemed like the school atmosphere was a bit heavy today, and it was also so crowded. However, everyone stayed a meter away from her and no one dared to approach her. Paul looked at her and froze.
Bessy?
Bessy answered with a nasal sound and then looked up. What? She still had her familiar expression. She wore a long coat that hung down naturally, covering most of the right hand, where only a little gauze was exposed.
Nothing.
Paul glanced at Anne sideways, bit his lollipop, and finally smiled.
I heard that they locked you up in the police station, and I was just preparing to bail you out.
He put his hands in his pockets, leaned over slightly, and told Kenneth not to go to the store. Why are you out? Anne looked at Bessy in disbelief. Because of Bessy's affairs, Grace and the others had a long time to discuss yesterday. They had yet to find a solution and could only wait for someone to give it a try today. According to the aggressive attitude of the White family last night, they had estimated that Bessy would have been locked up for at least 2 to 3 days. Who knew that within one night she would be back in school? Bessy put her hand in her pocket and turned away. Paul waved to Kenneth and immediately followed her.
Didn't she say that Bessy's crime got her locked up and she still had to stay there for a few more days? Yeah, how can someone locked up be here?
After Bessy and Paul had left, everyone looked at Anne and discussed it fervently. There was some panic in Anne's heart. As soon as she looked up, she saw Kenneth looking at her solemnly. Anne subconsciously pinned the hair that had fallen over her face behind her ears and pursed her lips. Grant family. Elise had come with Thomas. Mrs. Grant was very welcoming and even asked about Anne. Gerald Grant came down with his mobile phone. Elise, who had been sitting on the couch, stood up immediately with Thomas. Recently, everyone who knew anything knew that Gerald was about to be promoted. However, there was no specific news as to which position. Water to a fish was as Mrs. Grant to Elise. But in the face of Gerald, she was somewhat restrained. If it was not because Thomas was familiar with Jacob, they wouldn't have been able to see Gerald. Mayor Grant. Elise stood up. Gerald's eyes were almost inconceivable, and even she was very restrained. Thomas also greeted him. Gerald glanced at the two of them with the same expression on his face. He let Mrs. Grant and Jacob entertain the two and smiled.
I have a business matter to attend to, so I will take my leave.
Yes, please attend to your business, Elise said quickly. Of course, the mayor of a city was busy. How could she dare let Gerald entertain them? It was already unexpected for Elise to see him today. Usually, they could only see him on the TV news or in reports. However, this Gerald was truly not very sociable. Gerald nodded, held his cell phone to his ear, and strode out. Far away, Elise and Thomas faintly heard the word,
Miss Miller.
Elise paused, thinking about which big surname in Chicago had the word Miller. After thinking for a long time, she still had no clue, so she regained her senses and talked to Mrs. Grant. They didn't stay long before going out. Gerald didn't go to his office. Instead, he parked his car in front of a private kitchen. Although his license plate number was assigned and was very special because of his low-key behavior on a normal basis, few people in Chicago knew his license plate. After waiting for about 20 minutes, a taxi stopped at the door, and a girl in a plaid, thin shirt came down from the back door. The other person's earphones were plugged into her ears. She was looking down absent-minded and indifferent. Gerald, on the other hand, looked solemn and opened the car door to walk over.
Miss Miller.
He spoke first, with a steady and serious tone. Upon closer inspection, it was even a little respectful, as if he didn't seem to think there was anything wrong with calling a girl who was over 20 years younger than him, Miss Miller, Uncle Grant. Bessy took off her earphones and squinted her eyes. She saw Gerald clearly and nodded silently. Just call me by my name. Gerald smiled but did not answer. Bessy was obviously used to it. She said nothing and turned to walk in first. Let's go inside to talk. Gerald walked half a step behind her and helped her open the door. Near the opposite side, there was a very sharp braking sound. The black BMW stopped. What's wrong? Elise, who was sitting in the passenger seat, had been putting on lipstick when the car stopped. Her lipstick almost bumped against her nose. Thomas shook his head and looked at the opposite side.
Aunt, isn't that person Bessy?
Episode 41. Strong Reversal. Not far from Brightbow High School's door, the black car drove carelessly. Samuel was drowsy in the passenger seat.
Michael, Stephen Williams was brought to the detention center. I asked for Bessy and Scarlett's file in Fairfield, but I couldn't find everything.
Samuel thought it was strange. Normally, as long as the chief asked for it, such files were easily transferred over. He glanced over at Michael, who still hadn't moved, and raised his eyebrows. Michael had been the most active one before. He was sitting behind, leaning halfway on the window. Samuel felt he was weird and glanced over. He suddenly smiled.
Isn't that Bessy? Why is she coming out?
Marvin, who was driving, glanced at Michael's dark eyes in the rearview mirror and stepped on the brake subconsciously. Michael indeed got out of the car. Marvin couldn't help but take a closer look at Bessy. He muttered in his heart that he still didn't know what was so good about this high school student. Bessy had been called out by Susan. She still hadn't answered Grace's call. Grace could only go to the school and call for Susan to go to English class to find Bessy. There was a coffee shop in front of the school, which was quite quiet and had no private rooms. Grace and Elise sat by the window. Why are you looking for me? Bessy pulled the chair aside and sat with her legs crossed. She looked like she had no manners. She hasn't slept well lately, so her eyes were bloodshot and her expression cold and annoyed. She lowered her head halfway, not looking nearly as strong as she did at the police station a few days ago. Like a hooligan. Elise looked at her and frowned subconsciously. Those who would sit on the seat of the chief were usually people with inside information and who were familiar with the movements of the city. She took the coffee, drank it, and looked away. Grace's eyes turned to Bessy's left hand. She was holding a mobile phone in her left hand, and her fingers were long and smooth. Her right hand was slightly exposed, and she could see the thread of gauze. Grace remembered that she wrote with her left hand and was left-handed. She was relieved that her left hand was fine. Your hands. Are you okay? Grace uneasily grasped her wallet and spoke. It's okay, I won't become crippled. Bessy kicked the trash can beside her. Grace didn't know what to say and just opened her mouth. Bessy ran out of patience. She frowned and was quite irritable. Is there anything else? Otherwise I'll leave first. Grace looked at Bessy and clutched her purse even tighter. Your injury doesn't seem to be a big problem. About Stephen. Bessy leaned back, squinting at her indifferently. Grace remained silent for a while. Elise put the cup on the table. She looked at Bessy and spoke slowly, as if she was on higher ground. "Bessy, I don't wish for Stephen's matter to go to the courts." "What?" Bessy suspected she had heard wrong and wanted to dig her ear clean. She turned to the side, her left hand on the back of the chair as she stared indifferently at the two of them. "Say that again?" Bessy smiled and asked politely. However, Elise noticed that her eyes were cold and she wasn't actually smiling. Elise frowned slightly, turning thoughtful and hesitant. Could Grace's daughter also have such an expression? In the blink of an eye, the girl had withdrawn her gaze and lowered her eyes slightly. Bessy sat down with her back against the window. The window was half open and her expression couldn't be seen against the light. Elise sneered lightly. She must have seen it wrongly. How could she have seen that kind of expression? Grace felt like her thoughts were very normal, but she didn't dare to face Bessy directly and just squeezed the teacup subconsciously. "Bessy, you broke Stephen's hand, and his movements are difficult now, more so than your hand." Elise lifted the teacup, shaking it slightly and saying in a gentle voice, "You only injured your right hand, and you're left-handed too, so your injury won't affect your daily life at all. Why do you bother to fight this lawsuit that isn't beneficial to you?" Elise slowed her speech and saw that Bessy wasn't speaking. She thought that she had listened to her and couldn't help but say a few more words. Bessy didn't look at her and just knocked the teacup slightly with her left hand. She leaned back lazily against the back of the chair, carefree and unruly. She raised her eyebrow. "Continue?" "It's just messing around among kids." Elise slowed down a little and continued speaking. "You and that girl didn't suffer much anyway, so why must you cling to it? Even if it was self-defense. Because of the minor injury you suffered, the most he will be punished with is to pay for the medical expenses after the lawsuit. They might not even sentence him to jail, so why bother?" It was such a good reason. Because her hands were fine, because Scarlett was fine, so everything could be treated as if nothing had happened. Bessy felt a fire rise inexplicably in her heart, hot and dry. It only needed a little spark of flame to be ignited. "Oh." Bessy tilted her head and looked at Elise at that moment. Her lips curled and a low chuckle in her throat. "And if I don't? What if I want to investigate it?" Elise was a little surprised and raised her eyebrow slightly. She didn't expect Bessy to be so stubborn. Because of her good marriage, the Smith family basically followed her words, so she was used to being overbearing and always ordering people around. "Here is $500,000, in addition to the Williams family's $1 million. I will compensate for the other $500,000. Elise said in a suppressed tone and took out the check from the bag. She then pushed it to Bessy's side. Elise's patience had reached its limit. $500,000 was already an astronomical figure for someone who had never seen big money since young. Elise knew Grace very well. She was selfish, timid, vain, and greedy. Her daughter was probably the same. Bessy looked at the check on the table and lowered her eyes. Elise picked up the teacup again and took a sip. Then she saw that Bessy was staring at the check and said, "This is a check. You can go to the bank to exchange it for cash." Bessy just chuckled casually. Did she really think that she was a fool? That she didn't even know what a check was? "Did someone come and find you? Let me guess, was it Deputy Brown?" Bessy's voice was very soft as she stared at Grace and said in an undulating voice, "What benefit has he given you? What big favor has he done for you? Was it worth letting down your dignity and putting on a show as a good mother?" Grace and Elise didn't expect Bessy to have guessed it. She was actually accurate. Grace pursed her lips and finally couldn't help but say, "Bessy, how could you say that? What have you learned from your grandmother all of these years? Since when have you cared about me? You only know how to finger point at this moment." Bessy raised her hand and slammed the cup on the table. Bam! She looked at the brown coffee swaying in the teacup and felt very disinterested. "If there's nothing else, I'm leaving." Bessy pulled her chair and stood up. $500,000 is enough for you to live a carefree life for some time. Young girl, don't bite off more than you can chew and have too high of a standard. When you fall miserably, the gains won't make up for your loss. Elise opened her mouth intentionally after sitting at the side calmly. Did she think that $500,000 was too little? She wanted her to know her place? Bessy nodded and looked at Elise. She didn't drink the coffee on the table, just licked her lips and said, I also think you're right. One shouldn't bite off more than they can chew, or they will fall miserably. Elise heard her words and felt her heart jump suddenly. She thought about it and couldn't figure out what was wrong. She watched as Bessy turned and left the coffee shop. Elise smiled gracefully and said, I remember that you have a grandmother in the city's hospital. My brother has arranged your grandmother's ward and doctor. Bessy's footsteps halted and she turned sideways. Her dark eyes did not seem panicked as Elise had imagined. On the contrary, they were undulated and extremely cold. Are you angry? Elise was accustomed to power and didn't think there was anything wrong with her behavior. Of course, I wouldn't do anything to harm your grandmother, but you should also think about it. You need the Smith family's help even to find a hospital and a doctor, so... Elise chuckled softly. You can guess. Do you think I will let you find a lawyer in Chicago who will help you fight this lawsuit? Bessy, just listen to me. Grace heard this, panicked, and said with a dry throat,
What a big issue.
A clear male voice sounded from behind the door lazily.
Mr. Barnes, did you hear that? If you don't come to Chicago, we will degenerate to the point where we can't even find a single lawyer, all right?
Michael had intended to wait outside. Samuel had gotten out of the car and had said he wanted to drink coffee for a long time. Michael thought about it and also went to the coffee shop. There were very few people in the coffee shop, so he saw the 3 people sitting by the window at first glance. Michael stood at the door of the store. Bessy's back was to him, and he couldn't see her face from this angle, but he could see that the woman opposite her had her chin raised high in an arrogant and bossy manner. Samuel ordered a cup of coffee from the lady at the counter.
1 cup for takeaway, thank you.
Michael didn't want coffee. He just leaned slightly on the counter and stared lazily over at Bessy. He bit his cigarette and didn't move. After taking the coffee, Samuel was about to go down. He had found an excuse to enter, but didn't really want to disturb Bessy. Before the 2 of them reached the exit, they heard a voice that made them feel uncomfortable. You can guess. Do you think I will let you find a lawyer in Chicago who will fight your lawsuit? Episode 43. Am I late? Samuel took out his mobile phone to look at the time before touching his ear studs.
He got onto the plane when I called, so he should have just gotten off. Marvin checked. That Elise is from the Perez family. Perez family?
Michael squinted his eyes and tilted his head, looking confused. He seemed to be thinking about what the Perez family was.
Actually, I don't know very well.
Samuel coughed twice. There were hundreds of families in Evanston, and Samuel only remembered a few. He touched his head and said,
Anyway, they're done for. Yes.
Michael responded in a frustrated, low tone, and still didn't light the cigarette.
I want one of Stephen's hands. Is it appropriate?
Samuel knew about internal affairs.
I heard that the family is Bessy's teacher.
Samuel seemed to know a lot about Bessy, despite only knowing her for a short while. It seemed like the Williams family had a close relationship with Bessy. Michael turned slowly and said with dark eyes in an unhurried tone,
So what?
Samuel laughed. He had forgotten. This was Michael Clark, who wasn't afraid of anything. Grace accompanied Bertha for one night and felt mostly guilty when she occasionally thought about Bessy's right hand. She thought mostly of Bertha's words. Bessy's right hand. She pressed her temple and felt vaguely vexed as she entered the Smith family's house. Elise was sitting on the sofa. She had obviously rested well. She had delicate makeup on her face and was applying lipstick. When she saw that Grace was back, she glanced over. How was it? What did your mother say? My mother. Grace's hands tightened. She was a little afraid of Elise, especially since Bertha wasn't willing to advise Bessy. With Bessy's hot temper, she surely wouldn't let go. Forget it, I get it. Elise sneered. In that case, don't blame me for not thinking about your elder daughter. Aunt! Grace's eyes tightened. Bessy, besides her right hand, her left hand. Elise stood up, not bothering to listen further to Grace. In the end, whether it was Bessy or Grace, they weren't even considered opponents in her life and weren't even worth a ripple. Besides Anne, Elise didn't care about anyone else in Anne's family. Elise's phone rang. It was Deputy Brown, so she picked up. Elise was calm to begin with, but after she heard what he said, her expression changed drastically. Didn't you say that Bessy won't pursue him anymore? Deputy Brown's voice was trembling.
The court summons has come, and the rest of the sentence will come out today. I've been suspended.
David had promised to help speak for Deputy Brown, but Elise hadn't. As long as there was an opportunity, Elise would grab it. In her eyes, Bessy was just her sister-in-law's daughter from her second marriage and was different from Anne. She was accustomed to the luxurious power in Evanston and didn't even bother about people like Bessy. She had thought that this small matter was easy to resolve, but how was she to know that Bessy had only been found yesterday? And the court summons came today. It was really fast. It was a slap to her face. Elise's face turned dark. In the Smith family, even David had to give her face. She was used to it and had never faced opposition before. This good deed your daughter has done. Elise hung up and sneered, her chest heaving up and down. What's wrong? Grace also froze. Elise took the bag and started packing her stuff. Stephen was in a car accident on the way to court. Coincidentally, the brakes were broken. Grace, do you know how many years of sentencing will be given for intentional murder? Also, Elise walked to the door and sneered again. Guess if you think she can find a lawyer today. Aunt Ruth followed behind Elise respectfully and sent Elise out. Grace sat down on the sofa, feeling anxious. She picked up her mobile phone with shaking hands and called Bessy. Bessy, we're discussing the content of the group debate today. Do you want to do it together? After lessons, Mary took her pen and notebook and asked Bessy in a soft voice. Bessy sat in her chair with her eyes lowered. She pressed on the phone that was ringing wildly and used her left hand to flip her books. I'm only there to sell my face. Just give me the speech when it's time. You guys can go, Bessy said casually. Mary also felt like Bessy wouldn't be discussing anything there, so she nodded and went out with her book. English class's debate contest was full of passion. Carrying a basketball, Paul sat down at Mary's table. He turned his head and said, You actually participated in such a boring activity? I would have signed up if I had known. Bessy collected the foreign documents and responded casually, I'm just there to sell my face. She picked up her phone and stood up. For the past 2 days, she was wearing loose pants and a white t-shirt without a jacket. From the side, the wide pants made her seem extremely thin. Paul smirked. He put away the basketball and turned around. Are you going to the cafeteria? Mary asked me to line up for you. No. Bessy tucked her phone into her pocket and grabbed her thermos. She then said in a slightly moody tone, I'm going to the school doctor's office to change my ointment. Kenneth had told Paul clearly to avoid the school doctor's office unless necessary. Paul had always kept this in mind. He sent Bessy to the gate of the school doctor's office and carried the basketball to the basketball court. In the early morning, there were only a few people in the school doctor's office. Bessy opened the door and immediately smelled a fragrance. She looked inside. Samuel was whispering to Marvin, while Michael was facing a mannequin and holding a scalpel in his hand. He turned back slightly when he heard the door open and said in a low voice, You're here? There's oatmeal in the pot. Samuel kicked Marvin. Marvin immediately went to the kitchen and filled a bowl with oatmeal and fruit. He brought it to the table and set a few plates of early morning breakfast. In the process, he kept peeping at Bessy. The phone in Bessy's pocket was still ringing wildly. Looking at the oatmeal on the table, her cold body and originally low spirits warmed up almost instantly. After she finished eating, Michael put down the scalpel and walked over slowly to check the wound on her hand. Bessy lowered her eyes and looked at the injury on her right hand. Her grandma didn't know about her hand injury. Besides her, almost everyone around her thought that she was left-handed, even though she was a little confused herself and did whatever she wanted in her daily life. She didn't pay attention to her injured right hand. It had bled after she bumped into something 2 days ago. She was so used to it that she didn't feel anything. However, Michael had told her to come over to eat lunch and he could check on her wound. Subconsciously, Bessy had always paid special attention to her right hand when doing anything. She thought about what Michael had told her and tried her best not to put too much force on it.
There's no bleeding.
Michael loosened his grip and poured a glass of water into the thermos and handed it to her. He looked at her with clear eyes and said,
"It's okay today."
After Bessy went to class, Michael looked at her back as she disappeared from his line of sight before slowly withdrawing his gaze.
"Court opens today."
Samuel finished reading the text message on his phone, leaned over and smiled.
"Uncle Rick's actions are quite fast." "Yes."
Michael then picked up the scalpel again, his index finger tapping twice on the back of the knife before saying lazily,
"It's fast."
Marvin was paralyzed while listening to the conversation between them. He was filled with ridicule in his heart. How could Rick dare to not hurry? If he didn't hurry, Michael was going to flip Chicago upside down. Chicago, the court. Bessy didn't answer Grace's phone. Grace had no choice but to follow behind Elise. Today was a work day and the rush hour had passed, so Chicago's roads weren't too busy. Within half an hour, they arrived at the court. Nobody from Bessy's side was present. Seeing that there was no lawyer on her side, Grace really panicked. She was trembling and she didn't even care about her pride anymore. She just called David. She walked to a corner and said in an anxious, low voice,
As soon as she spoke, she talked about which lawyer would take Bessy's case.
The Smith family had opened up new markets and had been very busy recently, so David didn't know about Elise's every move. Hearing Grace's incoherent words, he sorted things out and said in a low voice,
"Give the phone to my sister."
"Brother, don't bother with this matter." Elise was fearless. She hung up and looked at Grace lightly, sneering. "I told you that nobody would dare to take up your daughter's case." The noisy courtroom suddenly fell quiet. Everyone was looking in one direction. At the gate, the police officer opened the door and a young man walked in, followed by 2 other people. He turned to look at the documents from them, then raised his head and smiled.
"I'm Miss Miller's lawyer. I'm not late, right?"
There was absolute silence in the court. The man looked down at his watch and chuckled lightly.
"It's 9. I'm on time."
He sat down and opened the document on the table. Then he looked at the judge and said politely,
"You can start."
The Williams family had hired a middle-aged lawyer with framed glasses and an aggressive appearance. But the young man in front was smiling, clean and gentle. His every movement brought calmness and even a sort of elegance, as if he was a celebrity. He didn't really have the Williams family's lawyer's imposing aura. The middle-aged lawyer presented the evidence and spoke eloquently. He fought for Stephen and kept going back to where Stephen was injured. The young man put his hand on the table and only occasionally looked up at the middle-aged lawyer. He looked gentlemanly and had no obvious change in his expression. He kept silent. The middle-aged lawyer presented a series of dossiers, each of them very organized. He spoke until his throat was dry. After he finished, he drank a glass of water and nodded to the judge.
"Judge, my statement is finished."
Grace stared at the young man closely, feeling uncertainty in her heart. Why didn't the young man say a word? Wasn't he Bessy's lawyer? Why didn't he dispute and argue against him? He was still so young. Could he just be a quack? Thought for a moment and went to the study to take a bank card.
"The password is 60. Take this to Bessy."
Thomas nodded. Anne was practicing the violin, but her thoughts were on what was happening downstairs. When Thomas was walking down, she opened the music room door. "Brother, where are you going?" Anne came out holding the violin and smiling. I just practiced a new piece. It's so much smoother now. Do you want to listen? Thomas had enjoyed listening to her play recently.
No, I just told Bessy I would find her at school.
Thomas raised his eyebrows, his voice light. Anne gripped the violin tightly and pretended that it was nothing. Oh. The school's medical office. Freddie put down his documents and surveyed his surroundings, wondering what kind of magic had made Michael come all the way here. Michael leaned lazily against the table, looking like a mannequin. He was quiet and attentive and had his eyebrows lowered like a painting.
Brother, we have telepathy. I just called you yesterday and you got on the plane too.
Samuel patted Freddie's shoulder and chuckled. Freddie frowned and avoided his hand in disgust.
Go away. Who has telepathy with you?
He thought for a while and then looked at Michael.
Michael, is Miss Miller some kind of sacred being?
Michael put down the scalpel on the table and tilted his head as if he had misheard.
What? What sacred being? She's just a pitiful one. Samuel snorted softly, and she doesn't know how to whine. Huh, no way.
Freddie was stunned.
Then why did the 129 Detective Agency approach me personally to let me come to Chicago and solve this case?
Samuel looked at Freddie as if he had seen a ghost. When he called Freddie yesterday, he had been at the airport. Samuel had thought that Freddie had received the notice in advance.
No way, did you get it wrong? What's with 129?
Samuel was rarely solemn.
They take this kind of trivial matter too?
Samuel couldn't accept it. He had little contact with the core members of 129 and only knew that there were a few great experts inside it. Out of the experts, one of them was especially expensive and was the most difficult to deal with. But what did that have to do with their pitiful little friend? As for Bessy being a member of 129, what a joke. Samuel didn't even think about this possibility. Michael also narrowed his eyes and stopped paying attention to his mannequin. He dragged a chair over and lifted his chin towards Freddie.
Tell me. It's just...
Freddie thought for a while and said,
I didn't ask much, but it seemed to be someone with the surname Grant.
I know. Samuel patted the table and seemed to have realized something. Uncle Rick told me before that Gerald Grant had contacted the police station. He's the mayor of Chicago, and it was probably because of his approval that the court could be opened so quickly. Michael had an impression of Gerald Grant. He was a capable person and had been promoted quickly.
I originally thought that he was showing favor to Michael, but it doesn't seem like it.
Samuel pondered over it.
So did he do it for Bessy?
But why was it necessary for him to go so far to find Freddie? He thought that nobody except Michael would do such a dull thing.
Bessy also knows the mayor?
Samuel was amazed. He was also especially curious. How could Bessy know Gerald Grant? He suddenly felt like Bessy was mysterious. Her identity was nothing much, but her people had more extensive and bigger backgrounds. Gerald Grant could be ignored, but 129 wasn't so easily overlooked. Michael didn't speak. He had never checked on her background before and had only investigated her files in Fairfield after this case had happened. His understanding of Bessy was limited to her relationship with Grace and the Smith family. Her family background was simple and her parents were divorced. Those who played politics were mostly shrewd, so Gerald Grant didn't seem like a good older man.
Let's go back.
Michael reached out and took his coat.
I'll revisit the file of Fairfield's 712 case from 3 years ago.
The sky was almost dark when Bessy went from the hospital to the school. The streetlights outside the school gate were turned on. Thomas was standing under the street lamp, his slender figure tall and straight. The first evening, self-study was taking place, and many students had taken advantage of this time to come out for supper. Thomas's eye-catching appearance attracted much attention. Watching as Bessy left the taxi, he frowned slightly, his gaze moving to her hand.
Is your hand okay?
It doesn't hinder my daily life. Bessy raised her eyebrows.
Then,
Thomas didn't know how to get along well with girls. If it had been Anne, she would have cried to him, and he would then give her his bank card. As for Bessy, she made it seem like it was nothing. Their personalities were too different, and Thomas was at a loss.
You have my number on your phone. If you're in trouble, remember to call me.
Thomas sighed. He thought about Grace's attitude and understood why Bessy was behaving like this.
Take this card.
He thought for a moment and then gently patted her head before saying in a slow voice,
Have you eaten dinner?
Yes. Bessy avoided him, still very cool. She didn't say much and just frowned slightly. Anne was standing with a group of people, with her lips pursed not far away. She already knew that Thomas had come out to see Bessy, so she had asked the driver to drive over, giving the excuse that she had left her papers in class. Who is that person next to Bessy? He's so handsome, and he seems quite familiar. The baby face beside Anne whispered. Anne didn't speak and just grasped her book tighter with her fingernails. Thomas was difficult to get close to. She had tried several years before getting closer to him. Usually, she was the one sticking to him every day, and she rarely saw him take the initiative to get close to someone. The scene was annoying to her. She didn't understand what else Bessy had besides her face. She was so studious and good at the violin, but why did Bessy have everyone surrounding her when she didn't even do anything? Bessy talked little to Thomas and entered the school gate within a few minutes. Thomas looked at her back for a few minutes before turning back to drive away. Let's go. Anne didn't go back home and went to her class. She glanced down at her cell phone, her eyes dull. Bessy didn't go directly to class, as the guard called her.
Bessy, come here. You have a courier.
Bessy looked good, so the guard recognized her. Recently, all the guards showed concern over her hand and asked more and more questions.
It's a little heavy.
The guard picked up the box.
I'll help you carry it to the door of your dorm. Then you can let the dorm auntie bring it up for you.
He picked up the box easily. Bessy had wanted to say that she could do it herself, but the uncle was very enthusiastic. She touched her chin, smiled, and turned her head slightly. Then help me get it to class.
Okay.
There were only half of the students in the class. Because class had ended, they were all sitting around. Mary was discussing a question with Riley Pete when she saw them. She immediately put down her book, took the box, and thanked the guard. Then she asked, Bessy, what's this? It's for you. Bessy sat back in her chair and leaned against the wall, propping her legs up casually. She then took out a book in a foreign language and set it on the table. She had wanted to dig out for candy, but thinking about her hand, she gave up. Mary's eyes lit up. Then can I open it now? You can open it whenever you want. Bessy flipped open her book. Mary immediately asked for a blade and opened the box. Other students came over to watch, and even Paul came over to sit on the edge of Mary's chair.
Hurry, the class is starting.
It looks pretty big. Is it a doll?
Let's see what gift our big boss Miller gave you,
Paul said. Before he could finish, he stopped suddenly and looked at Bessy, stunned. The crowd who had initially come to watch also fell silent. Bessy wasn't easy to get close to, but they found that she was a good person after a while. She wasn't like Kenneth, whose coldness could reject people from 1,000 miles away. It was mostly girls who came to watch the show. There were also some boys, but besides Paul, nobody else dared to go closer and just smiled from afar. Noah Hyber was one of the most popular stars online. As a capable singer, his appearance was also way above the typical crowd, even when placed among with the other famous stars. In 5 years, he had already won an American award for his debut song. He didn't produce many albums every year. As a professional singer, he produced 10 songs each year, and each of them was a best feature. Noah Hyber had thousands of fans, but there weren't many fans who collected all his albums. His early albums were gone. Episode 48. Impressive, Bessy. Bessy didn't stop walking. She waved at Mary and said softly, "Don't worry." They had already arrived in the classroom, and the judges were already scoring. It was their class's turn soon, and when Mary saw Bessy walking towards the podium, she quickly grabbed her notebook from her desk. "Then I'll give you my notebook." Bessy was already standing by the side of the podium, her fingers slightly cold. At the same time, the judges finished their scoring. Several city-level leaders were on the jury, and they all gave the average score after removing the highest and lowest scores. Anne got a score of 8.7. The rest of them were still discussing her presentation. The highest scores obtained by the first two classes were only 7.6. So Anne's score was by far the highest. "We got 8.7. The girl next to Anne suppressed her excitement and said excitedly, "It's the highest score." Her score was much higher than the others, and they all started talking about Anne. All eyes were gathered on her. Anne pursed her lips into a smile. She already saw that Kenneth and the others were back, so she turned to them and asked, "Have they found their script?" "I saw that Bessy went up empty-handed, so I don't think they did." The girl shook her head. "If they do badly now, the dean will surely be angry." How could he not be angry if she did poorly in front of the municipal leaders? "I heard that Bessy was the one who kept the scripts. She's really—" Another girl also whispered. Anne smiled, got up, and went to the leaders to get her feedback. While the leaders complimented Anne, the others whispered among themselves. It seemed like they were talking about Bessy, and two people even praised the school for having good-looking students. Anne was familiar with the dean, so she lowered her eyes and whispered, "Dean, Bessy's class lost their script, so it might not be too smooth. Don't make things too difficult for her." The dean was shocked, then he nodded. His expression wasn't too good. If the script was lost, it was an attitude problem. Soon, it was the English class's turn. Mary was sitting in her seat, signaling Bessy with her notebook. Bessy didn't return to take the notebook, just gesturing for Mary to rest assured. Rest assured? How could Mary possibly feel rest assured? Kenneth sat firmly and glanced at Bessy. She was standing straight, and her face wasn't as absent-minded and inattentive as before. She looked more serious now, and was so natural. She didn't look like she had stage fright. She didn't look like she was messing around. He paused and relaxed his eyebrows.
"Since she said not to worry, then she must be confident."
The other people were still looking for the script. English class was also furious that someone had deliberately taken Bessy's script. Someone scolded the person for being unethical. Abigail sneered and said satirically, "She did not participate in writing the script from beginning to end. She only knows how to play around every day and doesn't take things seriously. I already said since the beginning that we shouldn't let her participate." "Enough, Abigail!" A girl frowned. Who knew that there would be such a nasty student? Abigail heard this student's words, and her face turned dark, but she said nothing. She just glanced at Bessy and pursed her lips. She clenched the corner of her jacket, her fingers tightening. Bessy stood still and greeted the judges first. The dean raised his hand and asked in an undulated voice,
"Where is your script? Did you lose it?"
Bessy put her hands on the podium and smiled very politely. "Teachers and judges, I have memorized the script in advance, so I didn't bring my script." Everyone knew that it was considered disrespectful to this activity and to the judges to have lost her script on such a momentous occasion. Bessy had concealed that she had lost her script, but Mary, Kenneth, and the other people in English class were sweating. This debate contest was a development for the social sciences, which was a hot spot in the world, and all the universities were inclined to participate. Kenneth and Mary and the others had researched a lot of information and had included professional vocabulary used by other countries. Most importantly, no one knew better than Mary that Bessy didn't participate in this debate from beginning to end. She had only let Bessy read the general script this morning, and had only let her read the script once. Bessy hasn't even read the script enough times, so how could she have memorized it?
"It turns out that you have memorized it and did your homework in advance."
The dean glanced at Bessy and said solemnly,
"Then begin."
Mary's spine was cold and sweaty, and the people in English class all had dark expressions on their faces. Anne only stared at Bessy, her lips curled up. Bessy smiled very lightly. She picked up a piece of chalk and drew a stick figure on the blackboard of the back half. From the perspective of the teenagers, the technology system is roughly divided into 3 aspects. Half of the blackboard showed the slides, and the other half was empty. Her analogy was straightforward, but her explanation was highly vivid. Her tone was calm, and her speech was organized and without the slightest bit of stuttering. Mary was right. She looked good and was like the most beautiful background, even while standing still. Furthermore, when she talked, she wasn't unbridled like the others, but exuded a sort of unprecedented seriousness that made her whole presentation shine. Some people in the classroom whispered softly and even looked over subconsciously every few seconds. The expression on the dean's face changed from displeasure to surprise, and then from surprise to seriousness. All the classes sat in their seats, looking up at Bessy, dumbfounded. They couldn't return to their senses for a while, especially Mary, who had personally written most of the script. She had written it, so she still had a somewhat vague memory of it. Wasn't the first paragraph of Bessy's speech the opening statement? Bessy had only read through it several times, but she had memorized the whole script already? Kenneth kept staring at Bessy. Bessy's right hand was still injured, and although it wasn't obvious when she drew her drawings, it was a little slow and wasn't as clear and beautiful as with her right hand. But despite this, it was apparent that she had fundamental drawing skills, which was enough to shock the teachers and students in the classroom. Bessy stood by the blackboard, drawing pictures occasionally and then explaining her script. The previous 3 classes also had scripts in this speech contest, but nobody spent much time on it because there was too much content. Bessy was unique, however, and even dished out a few English words. Speeches were usually very dull and dry, but she managed to pull everyone's attention on her. The dean and the leaders were truly convinced this time. After Bessy's speech, he looked at the timer and then asked Bessy several questions. Bessy answered them, one by one. The leaders couldn't help but nod and praise this group for working hard. They turned to the dean to comment on the students of Bright Bow High School.
Yes, it's hard for you to be so decisive.
The dean nodded in praise. He had always been an unsmiling type, but was now looking at Bessy with the eyes of an old father.
You're called Bessy, right? Go down and call your members for the question and answer.
Bessy got down and saw that Mary and the others were still sitting on their chairs, staring at her, stunned. She smiled and didn't return to her seat. She just leaned on the side and said, "It's time for question and answer." Mary regained her senses and went on stage with her notebook. Their score ended up being 9.7. If it weren't because Mary and the others had taken their notebooks with them, they would have gotten more points. After they received their scores, Mary and the others walked down all the way. Bessy returned to her seat and leaned slightly on the back of the chair. The students in the classroom looked at her, but didn't dare to talk to her. Only the students from the English class were excited and noisy. When Mary and the others went back to sit, the students from the other classes started discussing with them. The following speeches didn't stand out. Not only did the students sound dull, but the judges were also bored. A total of 17 classes participated in this speech. The scores after Bessy were especially low, and the scores of the following 13 classes didn't exceed 8 points. The girl next to Anne patted her chest in relief. Fortunately, we were before Bessy, otherwise we wouldn't have even gotten 8 points. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that they had been lucky. There were 2 treasures in this school. One of them was Kenneth, who occupied first place all year round. The other was Scarlett, who was always second. Kenneth was in Bessy's class, while Scarlett's class didn't participate, so the English class naturally won from the content of their speech. Coupled with the speaker's performance, Anne was far inferior. If she had given her speech after Bessy, it wasn't certain if she could even get 8 points. Anne talked to her classmates with a smile on her face, but she felt extremely uncomfortable inside. She glanced over at Bessy subconsciously. Kenneth also glanced sideways at Bessy, narrowing his eyes, deep in thought. Anne pursed her lips and felt even more vexed. The people beside her talked about Bessy presenting without her script, and her smile was slowly fading. "First place! We got first place!" A bunch of people surrounded Bessy. Bessy, you're too impressive. You memorized such a long script." They got first place, but they still had to do self-study when they returned to their classroom. Everyone in the class crowded over. Bessy's lips curled and she sat at her desk smiling casually. She said humbly, "I just read it and remembered it." Paul teased her.
"If your memory is so good, you wouldn't have to come to school."
The others agreed, and then someone said that she drew very well. Bessy ignored him. Paul then thought of something severe and smiled at Bessy. Then he walked to the podium with big strides and sat at a table. He held the blackboard eraser in his hand and knocked it against the table loudly.
"Quiet down."
Everyone quieted down. The people surrounding Bessy sat down properly and didn't dare say a single word.
"Mary said that the script has always been in the region of English class. I asked a few people, and they said they didn't see anyone from their classes approaching."
Paul was smiling, but his eyes were cold.
"Thus, I suspect that it was someone from our class, and especially someone from the group. Whoever it is, stand up now."
Nobody in the class spoke, and they didn't even dare to breathe loudly. Paul nodded and continued smiling.
"Fine. That person probably forgot that we still have CCTVs in the classrooms and corridors. I will go to the surveillance room after school."
After he said this, everyone in the class exchanged glances and then discussed in low voices. "Paul is so handsome," Abigail's deskmate whispered, suppressing her excitement and squeezing her fists. "But the person who took the script is despicable. Who could be so jealous of Bessy that she would do such a wicked deed, like stealing the script? If Bessy hadn't memorized the script, wouldn't it have been over?" Abigail smiled. Yeah. Her hands were still squeezed tightly, and she was a little distracted. Episode 49. Bessy made you check, right? After school at night, Paul didn't go to the basketball court. Instead, he said something to Kenneth, and they went out.
"Paul, wait for me. I want to go too."
A boy who had attended the speech at noon knew that they would see the CCTVs.
"I want to see who lacks team spirit in our class."
Abigail's face turned paler. She glanced in Bessy's direction. Bessy didn't like to leave first after school and always enjoyed taking her time. Someone was hurrying Abigail. Abigail took her time and distributed the English answer sheets that she had collected yesterday. The English teacher had already marked them, and when she distributed Bessy's paper, she saw that she only got 4 points. Abigail didn't have ridicule in her eyes this time. She just looked around and saw that a few students were still discussing the questions. She pursed her lips, thought for a while, and left with her friends. The school's medical office. Bessy was here for sleeping pills. There were several bowls on the table with lids on them to prevent the heat from escaping.
"You performed well today."
Samuel laid on the table and grinned at her. "You probably won't be scolded." Michael wasn't in the school doctor's office, and Samuel said he had gone out.
"Hey, classmate, are you here to see the doctor?"
Samuel raised his head when he saw someone outside. It was a female student.
"He's off work, but I can still help you out."
"No, I came to find someone." The girl's face was red, and she turned to Bessy. "Bessy, can you come out? I have something to tell you." Bessy was sitting on the chair with a fork in her hands. She glanced over at her coldly. "Tell me here, I can't move." "It's a private matter." Abigail glanced at Samuel and pursed her lips. "It's not good." "I don't have any private matters with you." Bessy ignored her. Abigail just glanced at Samuel, her eyes watery. She was really about to cry and was seeking help from Samuel. However, Samuel just grinned and stepped back. He touched his ear studs and gestured to it.
"I won't remember what you say, little girl."
His gentleness towards Abigail had disappeared totally. Abigail's face turned pale, and she hesitated for a moment. When she saw that Bessy and Samuel were really ignoring her request, she squeezed her hands and said with a pale face, "Bessy, the matter at noon, it was me. But since you already memorized the script, it was still considered a blessing in disguise. Could you tell Paul not to bicker about it with me?" Abigail didn't even think that Paul would go to the surveillance room for Bessy. Everyone in English class knew that Paul only listened to Kenneth. Since when did he care about other people's affairs? Even Anne couldn't win over Kenneth's influence. But how long had it been since Bessy was here? Abigail was really scared now that Paul had intervened. She didn't dare to tell Paul. Although Paul appeared mischievous usually, he was actually a young master that everyone was fearful of. And he also carried a fierce aura. So, she could only come to beg Bessy. Bessy looked up without a surprised expression on her face. She threw the fork on the table loudly with an expressionless face, but her body was burning in rage. Abigail was startled. "You!" Bessy cleared her throat. She was about to say something when she smelled a familiar cold fragrance. The tense atmosphere eased for a moment. Bessy looked over. Michael was still wearing a patternless black shirt with a row of transparent buttons. He held his phone in his hand and seemed to be talking to someone. A young man followed 3 steps behind him. He seemed to sense a strange atmosphere in the school doctor's office and narrowed his eyes.
"Call me again later."
He hung up and didn't even look at Abigail. His eyes fell on Bessy and then swept over to Samuel. Abigail stared at him and was stunned for a moment, unable to react. Samuel touched his chin and signaled a little to him. He knew about what had happened to Bessy in the afternoon. Abigail's sentence, "But you memorized the script," and "blessing in disguise" made it very obvious. Samuel wasn't stupid. As he kicked out the chair and moved back, he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes,
"Oh, this little girl deliberately stole Bessy's script at noon and wanted to see Bessy make a fool of herself in front of the whole school. But she didn't expect that Bessy had not only memorized the whole thing, but she also gave an amazing presentation. Someone wanted to check the CCTVs, so she came over to beg Bessy to keep the peace and gloss over the matter. According to the prosecution's norm, if revenge and framing caused the victim's personal rights to be damaged, resulting in mental disorders, etc., then the person who committed the crime has to face imprisonment or detention for up to 2 years. Freddie, who was behind Michael, looked at Abigail, turned and chuckled. "Miss Miller, do you need a lawyer?" "I really didn't mean it." Abigail returned to her senses and panicked. She sobbed softly and said, "Bessy, don't." "You didn't mean it?" Michael put away his phone and glanced at Abigail. His delicate eyebrows were eased and he looked quite gentle. "So, the script ran to you and then threatened you to throw it away." His words were full of mockery. It was pretty poisonous. Abigail froze and felt the 3 men stare at her with a strange expression. Her face turned red and then dark. Under Michael's mockery, she couldn't bear it and ran out of the school doctor's office while choking. Freddie looked away and turned to stare at the only girl in the school doctor's office. He knew that she was probably the Miss Miller that he had been curious about. Bessy wasn't curious about him. She didn't pick up a fork and took the thermos on the table instead. Michael had wanted to make a call, but he narrowed his eyes as he watched her and forgot about it. He came over and helped her unscrew the lid before pouring her a glass of water. During this period, when Bessy's hand was injured, Mary and Michael both helped her unscrew the lid. She took it, familiar with the movement, and thanked him after taking a sip. Freddie had wanted to talk to Bessy. What had he just seen? He turned again and saw Samuel with 1 foot on the table. He didn't seem curious about the scene at all, as if he were used to it. Freddie was such a calm and sensible person usually. He had always gotten to the point in the courtroom and was extremely sharp with his words. But now, he was stunned for a full minute before he sat down thoughtfully on a chair at the side. Then, he let Marvin pour him a cup of tea. Today, Bessy was in a good state and didn't have to change her bandage. Instead, she took a bottle of sleeping pills and stuffed it in her pockets before taking her book from the table and returning to her bedroom. Freddie didn't find an opportunity to communicate with her in depth from the beginning to end. And she wasn't curious about Freddie at all. She just bowed her head in greeting and continued eating. After eating, she just left with her sleeping pills. She was cold and rather charismatic. "This little girl." Freddie stared at her back as she left. "No wonder people are jealous of her."
Michael watched as she left and then turned to Marvin. He said in a low voice,
"Go and investigate what happened."
Marvin responded numbly. Michael picked up his phone and continued his call. He saw an answer sheet on the floor out of the corner of his eye and picked it up. Bessy had dropped it accidentally when she took her book. He had wanted to look at it casually, but when he saw it, Michael paused for a moment and his grip tightened slightly. Freddie was sitting opposite him and was quite curious. He leaned over to see it and saw that the answer sheet received only 4 points. He laughed at first, then turned and seemed to find something wrong. Samuel put his hand on the back of the chair and smiled.
"This little girl is good at everything, but her IQ is poor. It's rare to see her getting a double-digit score. It's really sad."
Samuel sighed. Freddie glanced at him expressionlessly, then pointed to the answer sheet.
"Are you sure her IQ is low?"
Samuel was stunned.
"She got 4 points. What's wrong?"
He got up from his chair and leaned over to look at the answer sheet. He looked for a long while and couldn't see anything besides the 4 points. Michael kept the answer sheet, deep in thought. Freddie glanced at Samuel with an inexplicable sense of complication.
"Nothing."
Samuel's lips twitched, and he suddenly felt like Freddie wanted to fight with him.
"It really is her."
It was getting dark, and Paul had finally found the video he wanted from the bunch of data. Abigail? Several boys in the class looked at each other. Kenneth leaned on one side, his posture elegant and his eyes cold.
"Copy it and let's go."
Paul had already copied it with his mouse. Boom! There was a knock on the door. The boys thought that it was the security guard, but when they turned around, they saw a girl standing there.
"Anne, you're here to find Kenny?"
Everyone knew her because of her relationship with Kenneth and Paul, and they all knew that she was on good terms with Kenneth. Anne smiled and turned to Paul. "What do you intend to do?" Paul tossed the USB in his hands and smiled.
"Publish the video?"
"I bumped into Abigail on the way here, and she's in an awful state." Anne sighed and pursed her lips. "Have you thought about how much pressure Abigail would face if you published it? What if she can't handle it? What if she takes it too hard?" She paused and then laughed. "Did my sister make you check the CCTV?" Not anyone could casually check the security department's surveillance videos. They weren't policemen. Only Paul had this resolution.
"Then have you thought about what your sister would be facing if she hadn't memorized it?"
Paul paused and put away the USB flash drive. He stood by the table and laughed.
"Also, you seem to be very malicious towards your sister. She's not the kind of person who will seek help from others."
"How do you know she isn't that kind of person?" Anne stared at Paul and asked. "I've seen her like that many times. She doesn't say anything, but she acts like she's been wronged. Just look at how your whole class is acting sympathetic to her experience. If you publish the video, won't you make Abigail discriminate against? No one can beat her in terms of tactics." Episode 51. Bessy, I'm sorry. "Mary, what do you mean? Fine, I didn't want to bicker with you at first, but if you slander me again and again because of what Bessy told you..." The rest of them could tell that Abigail was outraged. Abigail's deskmate immediately pulled Abigail and said softly, "This might be a misunderstanding and might have nothing to do with you and Bessy. Drop it." Abigail's eyes were red with anger, and she looked like she wanted to kill Bessy. Everyone really thought that she had been wronged deeply. A few students even wanted to comfort her. It was as if she was the biggest victim here. Mary looked at the silent Bessy and felt uncomfortable. Before self-study, Mary had gone to Riley to discuss a math question. The math teacher had discussed it in class, and Mary had understood it. Bessy circled a few questions in class and said that she didn't understand, so Mary had explained it to her. Mary also only understood half of it. Although she knew that Bessy wasn't serious about studying, she didn't want to teach her half-heartedly either. So she had gone to find Riley to discuss the problem and had wanted to understand the question from the topic to the formula to the answer. After the two of them discussed the problem, Mary had sorted out her thoughts by writing them down. Riley had let her think by herself. She then picked up her phone and continued sliding on it. When Mary finished thinking about the problem, she found that Riley's expression was strange, so she subconsciously glanced over at her phone. She saw a surveillance video. There was an image of a girl tearing a piece of paper in the corridor. She was facing to the side and the camera wasn't obvious, but it was evidence that the girl was Abigail. Mary had experienced the nervousness of having lost her script firsthand. Under that sort of circumstance, the script had been lost in front of Bessy. If Bessy hadn't had such a good memory, their class would definitely have lost face in front of the city leaders and the TV stations. This meant that their efforts had been in vain over several days, and the source of all this would have been projected onto Bessy. So, the English class had cooperated after knowing that the script had been thrown away. They had expressed anger towards the person who had done this and had hated the same enemy. After knowing that this had been done by Abigail, Mary felt frustrated and angry. What made Mary feel most unexpected was that Abigail still felt aggrieved even after she had exposed her. Abigail's deskmate glanced at Mary at this point. "Mary, you should drop it too." Because of Abigail's performance, the people in the class all felt like Mary might be a little unreasonable. "You want to bicker over it? Fine." Mary took Riley's phone and held it up. She wasn't smiling and didn't even bother explaining. She just enlarged the screen and pushed the phone into Abigail's hands. She said in a soft voice, "Look at it." But her deskmate suddenly let go of her hand. "Why, what's here?" Abigail sneered and lowered her head. She originally wanted to continue ridiculing her, but before her words reached her mouth, her face suddenly froze. Her expression changed and she wanted to delete the video. Mary stared at her. "This video is on the forum." It couldn't be deleted. The other students in the class quickly took out their mobile phones and flipped to the school's forum. The post was on the first page and was very easy to see. Abigail looked around subconsciously, and her deskmate, who had wanted to speak up for her, took a step back while holding her phone, looking at her with precaution. In the video, Abigail's side profile was easy to recognize. She tore a few pieces of the paper and threw the USB flash drive into the trash can. Then she poured water on it, her side face smiling sinisterly and strangely. The clarity wasn't in the Blu-ray version, but the expression on her face could be seen clearly. Abigail's appearance made everyone in English class gasp and become completely stunned. She had said that Bessy had put on a play all by herself, that Bessy had deliberately framed her, but now it seemed like she was talking about herself. This surveillance camera showed who was innocent and who the culprit was in a glance. Abigail had looked wronged just now, so some people really doubted that Bessy had really put on a play by herself, and many also thought that Mary had been making trouble. But now, it was highly ironic. They had defended the true culprit, Abigail. Bessy had saved the face of the English class and had maintained their reputation only to be spurned and suspected by them. They even felt disappointed for Bessy. And how did Abigail put on a face of innocence and anger and push all the blame onto Bessy? "Bessy, I'm sorry." Abigail's deskmate bowed to Bessy, her face full of guilt. Then she went back to her seat, ignored Abigail, and moved her books to the space between their desks. She was already so scheming at this young age. If it hadn't been for the surveillance camera, then wouldn't Bessy have had no chance of dispute? The other students who had talked before also came up to apologize. "I'm sorry, Bessy. Abigail's hands trembled and her mind was blank. She was simply dumbfounded. She felt like her mind had stopped working. What had she said all self-righteously just now? She had said that she initially didn't intend to bicker over the matter with Bessy, and the other students had believed her subconsciously because of this sentence. But now, it was simply a joke from beginning to end. She didn't even dare to look at the people she had a good relationship with before because they looked at her with disgusted expressions. She had thought that nobody else except Paul would have been able to get the surveillance videos. She had thought that everything was under her control. But this surveillance video had completely exposed her face. "Lying bitch, you're really disgustingly fake. You were the one who did it." How could you still pretend to have been framed and act all innocent and angry? Someone muttered in a low voice. She's simply shameless. Isn't she just jealous that Paul and Bessy are on good terms? The student sitting behind Abigail moved her table backward and scolded. Abigail said nothing. Facing her classmates' apparent rejection and accusation, Abigail bowed her head and ran out of the back door, stumbling on her way. Some people were still apologizing to Mary. She wasn't in a good mood, so she just shook her head and went back to her seat. She turned around and asked softly, "Bessy, are you okay?" "I'm fine, thanks." Bessy lowered her eyes and glanced at the video on her phone. She had hacked into the school's surveillance office last night. She had just wanted to take it out without the intention of using it. She lowered her head slightly and flipped to the school forum. The person who posted it had the ID, Lone Wolf. She couldn't find any clues. "I didn't even do anything." Mary was stunned and didn't know why Bessy had said this. "You even gave me Noah Hyber's albums. Do you know?" "I only had to use my mouth to get the albums." Bessy put down her phone and supported her chin with her cold fingers. "I can't compare to you." Mary looked up at her. Bessy smiled and didn't say more. After a while, she turned and looked at Mary. English class added more details to the story and spread it on the forum, full of righteous indignation, in less than half a day. It spread throughout the whole school. The students in Susan's class also discussed this matter all afternoon. They talked about how Bessy had reversed the situation after the script had been torn and spoke about Abigail. In the eyes of these students, Bessy became even more of a mysterious figure than Kenneth. "What a big deal! Bessy is Susan's cousin." Zoe linked arms with Susan. "Can you take us to your cousin after school?" As Susan raised her head, the people in class she was on good terms with looked at her with expectation and amazement. Her family background wasn't good, and her studies weren't as good as Pete's. This was the first time so much attention was focused on her. Susan promised them to wait outside Bessy's classroom. After school at night, Bessy left later than the others as usual. As soon as Susan saw her, her eyes lit up, and she waved but didn't have a chance to speak. Then she saw that not far away, an old man got out of a Mercedes-Benz and stopped in front of Bessy. Who was this mysterious man? How did he know Bessy? Bessy was holding her phone while walking slowly with her head lowered when a shadow was cast in front of her. She didn't look up, just changed direction and continued walking. The figure paused for a moment and seemed to find her reaction unexpected. But he immediately turned around and reached out to stop her.
"Mrs. Grant wants to see you. Please come with me."
The old man blocked her path and spoke in a heavier tone. Bessy finally looked up and said with cold and dry eyes, "Make way." Maybe it was because nobody had ever spoken to him like that. But the old man froze in place. Bessy went right past him. She had taken a few steps when she saw Susan. Bessy was without a doubt in a bad mood. Susan rarely saw her act this cold. "Cousin?" she called softly. "Yeah?" Bessy cleared her throat and narrowed her eyes slightly. "What's the matter?" "Oh." Susan glanced at the car not far away and wanted to ask who it was, but she refrained when she saw Bessy's expression. She said, "Mother heard that your hand was injured, so she asked me to invite you over on Saturday." "How did she know?" Bessy clenched her phone and thought for a while before replying. "Sure, I'll go." "Sorry, my cousin has always had a bad temper," Susan explained to her classmates with her head lowered when Bessy left. "Wow, her reputation is really well deserved. She's so cold." "I'm so excited." "Susan, I can't believe she's your cousin." "Who was that old man that got out of the car? He looks so good." Before Susan could open her mouth to explain, the group of people around her had exploded in suppressed, excited voices, and didn't feel as if she'd been ignored. Susan, who still wanted to explain further, stood in a daze for a long time. She stared in the direction of Bessy and found it too complicated to explain. "I don't know either." Episode 53. I Know Him. She was used to viewing the pages. She flipped through it casually and came across a post with almost 1,000 replies, with the words, "Most popular girl in school," on it. She knew that it was talking about Bessy, and so she couldn't help but click in. She saw the town plan at one glance, and the half-covered title behind it. Her eyes widened and her fingers froze in disbelief. Anne kept her phone at this time and turned over, asking in curiosity, "Susan, what's wrong?" Grace also looked over. Bessy was in the kitchen. Andrea put the lid on the pot and saw Bessy's heavily bandaged hand when she turned her head. "Stay there and don't touch the water." Andrea waved and wanted her to leave. Bessy thought about it and threw the vegetables in her hand back into the bowl of water. However, she didn't leave and just leaned against the door while squinting her eyes. Andrea thought about Grace's relationship with Bessy and sighed inside, but didn't force her to go out. "You found someone to install the air conditioner here, right? It's not easy for you to earn money. Don't spend it on my house. Although I don't have many skills, I can still feed my family." Andrea nagged and continued talking. "Also, don't buy clothes for Pete anymore." The last time in school, the bag that Bessy had asked Pete to bring back was full of new clothes for him. Bessy stared at the smoky pot and responded absent-mindedly. Andrea knew her temper. Although she had responded, she would probably still buy it. Several main dishes were ready, and the soup had been boiling since morning. Andrea took the soup out first, and Bessy followed with a few dishes. The atmosphere in the narrow living room wasn't very good. Grace stared at the mobile phone in her hand and lowered her eyebrows. She said nothing while Anne sat beside her, looking worried. Susan clenched her skirt in her hands. Fidgeting, Andrea put the pot on the table and asked, "What's wrong? What's with your expressions?" Grace looked up and slammed the phone on the table. She didn't look at Andrea. Her eyes fell on Bessy and her voice trembled as she asked, "Tell me honestly, where did the money you paid for your grandma's ward last time come from?" Bessy bent down and put the bowl on the table. Then she dragged a chair away and sat down at the dining table before answering impatiently, "It's my own." "Then what's this?" Grace got up from the sofa, picked up the cell phone and walked over to Bessy. She enlarged the picture and showed it to her. Bessy poured a glass of water for herself and leaned against the chair. It was a picture with a dark background. There were street lights and it was quite blurry, but her face could still be clearly seen in the picture. The person with his back to her couldn't be seen clearly, but he didn't look young. There was a Mercedes at the side. The photograph was too suggestive. Bessy's hand paused and she tilted her head. She looked at it for a moment and chuckled. "Did he give you money?" Grace's head was about to explode. "You never used the money I gave you, and now, what do you mean by this? Are you deliberately provoking me and taking revenge on me?" Bessy understood what Grace was saying. She looked up at Grace slowly, her eyes indifferent. Andrea also knew that something was wrong. She grabbed Grace's hand quickly. "Sister, don't be impulsive. Talk nicely to her first. Bessy isn't a disobedient child." Since she had misunderstood her several times, Grace erased her emotions and looked at Bessy. "Tell me, who is the person in this photo? Why did you meet him at such a late time?" Bessy poured herself a bowl of soup and said casually, "Why should I tell you?" Grace's head hurt with such an ambiguous answer. She didn't even want to stay further in the West family's house. She grabbed her bag and rushed off. "Sister, you... Oh!" Anne looked at Bessy and hesitated. Then she sighed and chased Grace. "Mother, wait for me!" Andrea still didn't know what happened. "It's nothing," Bessy said calmly. She finished her soup and ate another bowl of rice. After playing a game with Susan, she left the house and returned to school. Today was Saturday. There weren't many people on the road. The students from English class were still discussing. Some people were gesturing to Bessy, their motions filled with indignation. "Bessy, why didn't you answer my call?" Mary dragged Bessy over and asked in a suppressed voice. "Did you see the school forum?" Mary picked up her phone and opened the school forum to show Bessy. Female students nowadays can really do anything for money. Isn't this girl the freshman in that class? No wonder I saw her using luxury goods, even though she has a bad family background. Is this man old enough to be her dad? The replies under the post were increasingly insensitive. The comments on the photo were still increasing constantly. Bessy looked at it casually. At this time, someone knocked on the English class's door, and the person at the door stood up straight.
Bessy, come out.
It was a teacher. Bessy returned the phone to Mary and followed after the teacher. The people in the class stared at her and discussed the matter in low voices when she was gone. Over here, Bessy followed the teacher to the office, where several teachers were sitting.
This is the case, Miss Miller.
The dean recognized Bessy from the speech contest last time and had been very impressed by her, so his tone was still quite good.
Someone has reported you anonymously for having unchecked behavior. Do you have an explanation in regard to this?
Explanation? A female teacher glanced at Bessy in disgust. Students nowadays can do anything. A few teachers stopped her. The dean glanced at her and then turned his attention to Bessy, pondering.
Bessy, this matter has already spread onto Twitter. It has a bad influence on our school's reputation and also on you. Can you tell me if you know the person in the picture? Did someone Photoshop this, or are you really intimate with him?
If they didn't know each other, it would be much easier to settle this issue. Bessy raised her eyebrows slightly, then put down her mobile phone. She looked away lazily and chuckled. I know him. The dean was stunned. The female teacher looked at Bessy and sneered. But before she could talk, Bessy continued in a calm, unhurried voice. He's Gerald Grant. The female teacher had rushed to the school after receiving the report. Bessy looked so ambiguous that she was a little annoyed and said directly, Who is Gerald Grant? Can you contact him now? Why did you have to meet him at night? Before the female teacher finished speaking, the dean stood up.
Are you talking about the Gerald Grant I know?
Who else? Bessy nodded. Her voice undulated but was very polite.
I got it.
The dean looked at Bessy for a moment and his expression changed.
I will handle this matter. You can go back to class.
Dean, how can you just let her go? The female teacher didn't understand and yet didn't dare to be unbridled in front of the dean. But her tone was obviously not good. The dean looked at Bessy's back and was thoughtful. When he heard the female teacher, he narrowed his eyes and said softly,
What did you plan to do to her if she stayed?
You must call her parents and report her. The female teacher frowned. Won't this affect our reputation?
Report her?
The dean laughed and then nodded.
Should we report Gerald Grant as well?
He must be the scum in society. The female teacher thought of the post and frowned. Why can't we criticize him?
We can.
The dean tidied his clothes and smiled slightly.
You can go ahead and criticize him. You can hang our mayor on the school forum and criticize him by name. Go ahead. You're impressive.
After he spoke, the dean ignored her. He turned over and talked to another male teacher.
You can deal with this matter. The picture has just been released and shouldn't have too big an impact. Bessy is young and can't be affected. Delete all the posts for me.
The dean was old and wasn't the kind of person who didn't have foresight. From Bessy's unbridled and generous actions, he didn't feel like she would do something of that sort. Furthermore, the other party was the mayor, so there was no way Bessy would joke about it. The male leader responded and quickly contacted the others with his phone. The dean nodded and left the office. The female teacher stayed where she was, looking at the male teacher a little dumbfounded. What did the dean say? The mayor?
Look him up on the official website or turn on the local news at night and you might hear or see him.
The male teacher finished his phone call and smiled at her.
The mayor of this city should be easy to find.
The female teacher opened her mouth. The name Gerald Grant was well known in politics. She didn't know that the mayor's name was Gerald Grant. What had she wanted to do just now? Criticize Bessy and Gerald Grant? The male teacher was still talking to a group of people who managed the school forum, but the female teacher had no intention of listening. She sat on a chair and stayed there indifferently. In the evening, Bessy went to the school doctor's office. Recently, Freddie had been staying at the school doctor's office, and Michael seemed quite busy. Bessy changed her bandage and noticed the two discussing something in a low tone. Marvin had lowered his voice deliberately to ensure that she couldn't hear the contents of their conversation. Bessy sat in the corner and played with a computer that they seldom used.
"Bessy, would you like some water?"
Samuel asked her, placing a cup of water on the table. Bessy squinted and shook her head. "Okay."
"What are you doing?"
Samuel brought her a glass of water. Bessy was licking a lollipop while looking at the ID that had just appeared on the computer. She clicked something, causing the screen to switch instantly to a game page, and smiled slightly. "I'm gaming." Samuel smiled back at her.
"I can see you also play poker tournament. Did you watch the competition?"
Bessy bit into her lollipop and nodded vaguely.
"Then you must know Toby Yearling from the group OST. He's awfully powerful."
Samuel chuckled.
"Didn't he just win the championship? There's a playoff in Chicago next month, and the tickets aren't readily available, but I have a friend who knows the group, so I can bring you to meet him next time."
He believed he would be doing her a big favor. Bessy glanced at him and was silent for a while. "Oh." Samuel touched his chin and wondered why Bessy acted so different from the other Toby Yearling female fans. Poker Tournament traveled all over the world, and Toby Yearling was the first player from America to have made a name for himself abroad. The young boy was extremely popular among Poker Tournament fans in the country, but also boasted a fan club abroad. During the past 2 years, Poker Tournament had entered a new era known as the Sun God. Even Samuel enjoyed it greatly and would often use his privileges to get tickets to watch. But Bessy, on the other hand, was she a fake fan? Episode 54. Is it true? Because the post on the school forum had appeared inexplicably, its disappearance could also not be explained. The person who posted it kept reposting it, only for it to be deleted. This turn of events occurred during the school holidays, so not many people knew about it. On Monday morning, Bessy got up from her bed and noticed a pot of green plants beside it. She glanced over at Mary's bed. She had already gotten up. Bessy squinted and went to wash her face before heading to class. In the afternoon, Anne attended a student union meeting. The school forum was managed by the student union. Senior. Everyone in the student council knew Anne and greeted her politely. Anne nodded and headed to the technical department. She asked casually after chatting for a while, "I have a friend whose posts have been deleted without reason. Do you know what happened?" The school forum was free range. The administrator heard this and had an idea of what Anne was talking about.
"Are you talking about that post?"
He lowered his voice. Anne nodded. Her eyes flickered as she lowered her voice and asked, "What's the inside story? Why was it suddenly deleted? Is it because it painted the school in a bad light?"
"No, you shouldn't bother about this."
The administrator looked mysterious. "Why?" He sighed and said softly,
"Do you know who that person is in the picture?"
Anne didn't care about it, but she also didn't know who the person in the picture was besides Bessy, so she still asked, "Who?"
"Mayor Grant."
At that exact moment, Anne believed she had heard wrong. She raised her eyebrows and lowered her voice subconsciously. "Mayor Grant? Where did you get that scoop from?" Anne knew without a doubt who Mayor Grant was, but she had never seen him before. Her only association was with Mrs. Grant. Although Jacob Grant was Thomas's friend, even Anne had never had the chance to speak to him, but had only seen him on the television. The Smith family didn't have a close relationship with the Grant family either.
"It's an insider story. You must keep this confidential and can't tell anyone else,"
the boy said, afraid of the consequences.
"The teacher told me personally."
Anne pursed her lips and lowered her eyebrows. After a long while, she looked up and smiled. "How do you know if it's true?" She had never heard Bessy or Bertha say that they knew Gerald Grant. Anne didn't really believe it. If Bessy really knew Gerald Grant, wouldn't she have told Grace and the others? Why wouldn't she tell anyone?
"I'm not sure,"
The boy shook his head and pursed his lips again, deep in thought.
Nobody would make a joke with this, right?
Anne didn't say a word and seemed a bit distracted. In the end, she tucked her hair behind her ears and smiled. Maybe. This was a big story, but its impact was minimal, if any. In fact, when the picture had first come out, many people followed the story closely. Still, many others on the school forum had collectively come forward to defend Bessy. The post didn't have a huge impact on the school forum, but now that it had been deleted, it was more useless. Twitter probably had the largest traffic on the internet. Anne thought about it and absent-mindedly opened Abigail's chat. On Monday afternoon after class, Bessy sat on her seat and slowly arranged her books. Mary packed her belongings and went to the cafeteria after informing her. Bessy had always been sluggish and her fellow students all left quickly.
Bessy, someone is waiting for you downstairs.
A boy stood outside the door and shouted to Bessy. Bessy wasn't sitting straight and looked a little lazy. Her whole appearance and style were unique, and her long, soft hair was tucked behind her ears, which made her appear devoid of feelings. Bessy nodded, which made him think of her pretty smile. Pete was waiting for Bessy downstairs.
Is the school forum bothering you?
Pete wore a black and red plaid shirt. He looked relaxed as opposed to his cold persona that he always put up. He was usually quiet, which made people adamant to speak to him. His warm-colored clothes had somehow helped him come out of his closet. Bessy wondered why Pete was looking for her. She smiled, holding her phone in her left hand. "I'm fine." Pete nodded, and the hand in his pocket relaxed. Pete had been voted the most popular boy in grade 1 the moment he began schooling, and this made him somehow famous. Many people considered him cold, but he wasn't as arrogant as Kenneth. The coldness just seeped from his bones. Susan waved at Pete from a close distance. "Cousin." Susan knew about the post on the school forum. She didn't expect things to have calmed down when she came to school on Monday and couldn't help but glance at Bessy. Bessy nodded. She was on her way to the school doctor's office. Pete went home with Susan, and they split ways. Not far away, the sound of a motorcycle's engine rumbled. Susan was surprised. Did someone ride a motorcycle to school? Zoe stood beside her and quickly pulled her sleeves, her expression changing. "It's Brian Jake. Don't block the road." Brian Jake? Susan wondered why that name sounded so familiar. She had often heard his name from the other girls in class, and he seemed to be a school bully that shouldn't be provoked. She couldn't help but look towards the source of the sound, only to see a royal blue motorcycle towards where they had been standing. It drove blatantly in school and did not stop. Pete stood beside Susan and Zoe and couldn't help but stare at Brian. "Stop looking. Brian Jake is the next school's bully." Zoe patted her shoulder. "I heard that his family has connections with the underworld. Can't you see that nobody is stopping him from driving his motorcycle in school? That motorcycle must cost at least a few $100,000. Susan was even more surprised. She nodded, but her eyes followed the motorcycle closely. At the same time, Anne got off at Hotel Kennedy Grand, and Grace was standing in the lobby waiting for her.
"You're just on time."
Grace smiled brightly at Anne. "Mrs. Grant is already waiting upstairs. You can get closer to her." Anne already knew this and followed Grace upstairs. Jacob Grant didn't come today. He was supposed to come, but he had been delayed by something. Thomas was there. "I heard Anne is going to visit a famous teacher in Evanston." Mrs. Grant looked at Anne with a smile. Anne pursed her lips slightly. "Yes, I'm practicing to score for him." Grace let someone bring Anne's violin over. She saw that Miss Grant liked it and requested Anne to perform a piece. Anne didn't hesitate even for one moment. The piece she had rearranged was already familiar to her. Other than the difference in artistic style, her proficiency and basic skills would help her play well. Mrs. Grant watched as Anne played the last note and was inexplicably a little distracted and thoughtful. "What's wrong?" Anne's heart jumped at the sight of Mrs. Grant's expression. Mrs. Grant returned to her senses and took a sip of tea before smiling slightly. "It's nothing. You're very good. You should consider going on tour." It was just that Mrs. Grant felt like this style was very familiar. She had probably heard it before, but she couldn't pinpoint from where exactly. She seemed deep in thought. Anne was used to compliments and had this level of confidence. She pursed her lips and said, "Oh yes, Mother, about my sister, I don't know if—" Grace frowned and knew what Anne wanted to say. She hurriedly signaled Anne not to utter a single word to Mrs. Grant. Anne pursed her lips and glanced at Mrs. Grant, still hesitant. "Tell me." Mrs. Grant took a piece of tissue paper and wiped her hands. Anne seemed hesitant and then finally sighed before saying, "I heard that my sister knows Mayor Grant. Is it true?" Mrs. Grant paused and looked up, slightly surprised. "You have a sister?" Out of courtesy, Mrs. Grant didn't know much about the Smith family. How was she to know that Anne had a sister? Anne also looked up. She didn't expect Mrs. Grant to not know about Bessy's existence. Grace subconsciously picked up a cup of tea and avoided Mrs. Grant's inquisitive gaze. She always deliberately avoided talking about Bessy when she hung out with acquaintances. "Yes," Anne reacted and smiled. She felt bad, so she pursed her lips instead. "She told people that she was close to Mayor Grant, so I just wanted to ask you. Who knew that Mrs. Grant didn't even know about her existence?" "She told people she was close to Gerald." Mrs. Grant seemed to understand the situation after hearing Anne's words. She carried her teacup and laughed. "That's strange. Gerald isn't close to a lot of people." "Oh, so they don't know each other." Anne lowered her head and covered her smile. "I must have heard wrong then." Because Jacob Grant wasn't here, Thomas was sitting at the side and was just serving the tableware for the ladies without speaking. But hearing this, he looked up and asked Anne,
"Who did you hear this from? She doesn't seem like the kind of person to say such things."
Thomas also understood Bessy. She didn't talk much and was cold. She was the complete opposite of Anne and had a sense of carefree spirit between her brows. Because of this, he subconsciously defended Bessy. Anne pursed her lips and looked at Thomas. She felt moody, but still feigned a smile. "I heard it from someone else." Mrs. Grant wasn't very interested in Anne's sister and changed the topic to inquire more about Anne. Anne wasn't considered the best amongst the ladies in Chicago, but she was still rather famous. It was rumored that she played the violin well and was much better than Scarlett, who only stayed at home gloomily every day. She took Anne's hand and chatted with her for a long time. When Mrs. Grant left, Grace asked Anne, "What's going on with your sister?" "I don't know. I heard from someone else. She used Mayor Grant's name and made them take down the post," Anne said lightly. Episode 55. It's on the hot search. The school's medical office. Freddie carried a curly dog with black eyes out of nowhere inside.
"Marvin, prepare a cage for me. I'll let someone send it over to your goddess, so you must be careful with it."
Marvin was always very slow and kept a straight face. He wasn't very serious about this matter. When he heard Freddie mention his goddess, his spirits quickly rose. He took out his phone contacts and helped Freddie conclude the matter quickly. Samuel was playing with his mobile phone and sitting next to Bessy. He didn't look up and explained,
"Marvin's goddess likes dogs. Other than Michael, Marvin is most attentive towards her."
He pressed his phone with one hand and explained casually. He swiped onto a page and his smile slowly faded. He turned and saw Bessy holding a foreign language book with her head looking down, concentrating. Samuel pursed his lips and put away his phone. He then stood up and gestured to Michael, who was fiddling with the mannequin on the other side. Michael's original intention was to ignore Samuel, but when he saw him mouth,
"Bessy,"
he thought for a while and put down the stuff in his hands. Then he followed Samuel out slowly.
"A picture of Bessy and Gerald Grant has been posted by someone on Twitter, and it had been put on the hot search for promotion."
Samuel frowned anxiously.
"I went to get the surveillance video last time from the school and posted it on their school forum. I suspect that it was the same person."
Michael nodded, his expression surprisingly calm. But his eyes became darker.
You know the marketing techniques have always been disgusting. What can we do now? Should I make people take it down?
Samuel didn't understand the relationship between Bessy, Gerald Grant, and Principal White. But to his knowledge, it had been related to the case from 3 years ago. He handed the phone to Michael. Michael scrolled through it and saw the usual sensitive and disgusting things on Twitter. The comments below were naturally unsightly. Samuel saw Michael's expression darken.
Do it.
Michael took out a cigarette from his pocket. Then he thought of something and didn't light it. Just played with it in his hand, his usual lazy smile gone. He threw the phone back to Samuel, bit the unlit cigarette, and said in a cold voice,
Also, investigate this person. This person has brought so many marketing spots on the platform. They must not be an ordinary person. I want to see who would be so malicious towards a high school girl.
Samuel thought, who in Evanston doesn't know the level of Michael's scheming? If this idiot knew that Michael is controlling the scenes, he would cry. The spread of Twitter was unthinkable to everyone in school. Samuel had already suppressed most of the marketing spots, but the next morning, the majority of the netzines on Twitter had already arrived at Brightbow High School. The personnel department of Brightbow High School held an emergency meeting regarding this matter. Nobody could ever think that this matter could spread like wildfire throughout the school. It was around the same time that the English class came to know about this. Mary and Riley went to the toilet together to wash their hands and heard some people whispering about it. They searched, and out popped a bunch of popular Twitter posts. They hurried back to the classroom to find Bessy. Bessy, Mary frowned. The people on Twitter are crazy. They don't even know you but are talking nonsense and even want people to come find you. Twitter? Bessy glanced lazily at her. Don't you have Twitter? Bessy paused and chuckled. I haven't used it for half a year. Your worry right now shouldn't be about Twitter. Go and look for the dean first. Mary's thinking was clear. We can't deal with this matter on our own, and only the school can settle it. Mary understood Bessy's temperament after such a long time with her. She knew that Bessy didn't care about this matter, so she dragged Bessy to Mr. Scott's office. Unexpectedly, Mr. Scott also went to find her.
The school leaders are also looking for you. Come with me.
Mr. Scott pushed down his glasses and smiled gently. Bessy followed Mr. Scott and went to the dean's office building. The female teacher from last time was also there. She didn't dare to look at Bessy and just carried on with her tasks. But when she came out, she saw Anne going upstairs with a pile of materials. The female teacher knew her, and they exchanged pleasantries. Anne looked into the office. It's Bessy. The female teacher was surprised. You're close to her? Not really, but I just talked to Mrs. Grant yesterday. Anne tucked her hair behind her ears. It's the mayor's wife. I heard some students say that Bessy knew Mayor Grant, so I asked Mrs. Grant when we were eating, but she said she didn't know her. The female teacher paused violently and turned. Thank you so much, Mrs. Miller. She turned and hurried straight to the dean's office. Anne stood on the spot and stayed even when the female teacher had left. The materials in her hand were actually a guise. She lowered her head and pursed her lips slightly. Thomas's attitude last night had made her a little flustered. After thinking for a while, she lowered her head and dialed a number. Hello, Mom? Anne glanced over at the office, her eyes shining. Nothing. I just wanted to tell you that I saw Sister in the dean's office. Did she call you? After one night of inquiries, Samuel finally found the person who was behind the Twitter fiasco. He was surprised when he got the information.
Who is it?
Michael put down his pen and pressed his temple, his tone calm. Samuel leaned to one side, stuck his hand in his pocket, and revealed the information.
You would never have guessed. I traced it back to the White family, and it seems this person has something to do with the White family. White family?
Michael leaned on the backrest and knocked on the table with narrowed eyes.
Principal White isn't that kind of person. Of course not. This is just a small figure who was associated with the White family. How could this person know Principal White?
Samuel laughed and then frowned.
This person also knows Kenny.
Michael glanced at him. thought of the name and was uncertain.
Kenneth White?
Yeah, Samuel snorted. But it wasn't Kenny who contacted the marketing person. It was Anne, Bessy's sister. I think she knew about the marketing person through Kenny. Samuel was too lazy to remember his name. Michael smiled.
She's quite bold.
Maybe she didn't expect anyone to check on her. Samuel analyzed him closely and noticed Michael's cold eyes.
Do you have evidence?
Michael picked up his pen again. I have a few screenshots and the transfer records. Samuel reached out to touch his ear studs and clenched his teeth. Michael nodded and said in a nasally sound,
Split it in 2. Send 1 to Principal White and leave 1.
Samuel understood Michael's meaning. He printed out a few sheets of paper and put it away.
Okay, leave it to me.
At the same time, inside the office, the dean was polite towards Bessy.
Last night, some people had already subdued the hot search, but some insiders are still adding fuel to the fire. The school will settle the rest.
Mr. Scott was very anxious. He had come to the dean to minimize the impact of the incident, but he didn't expect the dean to have arranged everything before he had spoken to him. He was a little stunned. The dean looked gently at Bessy.
Do you have any questions?
He actually knew about Bessy long ago, ever since David had given him her files. At that time, he had rejected her. But who knew that she would be recommended by the principal to attend Brightbow High School? She was also linked to Gerald Grant, so the dean found to treat Bessy badly. Bessy raised her head and thanked him. She was polite, but her face was expressionless.
Sorry for the trouble.
Mr. Scott's tense nerves loosened in an instant, and he quickly spoke for Bessy. He had been wondering how Bessy would have done such a thing when she had been such a good student. Bam! At this time, the door was rammed open.
Dean, I just got news that Mayor Grant doesn't know any high school students.
The female teacher walked in and stared at Bessy, her expression weird.
What are you talking about?
The dean pressed onto his temple, his head aching.
You don't have to intervene in this matter.
The female teacher looked at Bessy, sneering. I knew it. Why don't you ask Bessy if she really knows Mayor Grant? The female teacher knew Anne's identity. She would never lie, so the liar must be Bessy. Unexpectedly, after she was done talking, Bessy wasn't in the least bit panicked. She just glanced at her indifferently. Mr. Scott was a little confused. Why was this linked to Mayor Grant again? Dean. The female teacher looked away from Bessy and turned her attention to the dean. Miss Miller only used Mayor Grant's name to make the school cover for her. She doesn't know Mayor Grant, in fact. This behavior is extremely vile. The dean's forehead was throbbing. He turned to Bessy and said in a soft voice,
Miss Miller, can you contact Mayor Grant?
After a pause, he said again,
Of course, it's not that I'm doubting you. I just have a few details that Mayor Grant should clarify. He is involved in this matter, after all, so we must take some precautions.
Bessy stood still on the spot. She tilted her head, glanced at the female teacher and thought about something. Then she smiled and nodded. Sure. She was still calm and unhurried. The female teacher felt like something was wrong and didn't quite understand it, but she still passed her phone over. Wait, I found the mayor's hotline. You can call it. She handed the phone to Bessy. Bessy didn't look up and just turned the phone in her hand. She opened her address book and found a name. The female teacher glanced over. It was the address book, and she saw 3 words on it. Gerald Grant. She was so good at pretending. The female teacher didn't think that Anne had fed her false information, but she was anxious to expose her. She opened her mouth directly and said satirically, You even have the mayor's private number. You can call now then. Bessy ignored her and dialed the number directly. Episode 56. How did you know such a person? 2 rings and the call connected through. Gerald's voice was on the other side of the call.
Miller.
Hello, Mayor Grant. Our dean wants to say a few words to you. Bessy directly interrupted him. The voice on the other end paused for a while.
Okay, hand your phone over.
Gerald's voice became more professional. The dean explained to Gerald.
My apologies. I gave something for the child to eat and didn't expect this sort of big thing to happen. I have a meeting and can't take my leave. I'll let my secretary head over to the school. You don't have to worry about this matter. I will handle it well.
The office was very quiet, and everyone around could hear Gerald's voice. After all, he was Gerald. He was imposing and his words were clear and concise. From the moment she took her phone out expressionlessly to the moment she said her first sentence, the female teacher had felt an unknown hunch inside. The office was silent for a moment. Knock, knock. Someone knocked on the office door, and the dean and the others immediately stood up. But it wasn't Gerald's secretary that came in. It was Grace who hurried inside, the makeup on her face slightly messy.
I'm sorry, so sorry, Dean. My child has caused you trouble.
Grace quickly apologized and glanced at Bessy, who was sitting on the side while looking down and playing with her phone. She lowered her voice and said in a low tone,
Bessy!
Bessy didn't look up and just ignored her. She kept her head lowered. Grace's head ached even more. She opened her mouth and was about to say something. At this time, she felt a shadow fall in front of her. A young man carrying a briefcase walked in. Those who were a little more concerned about the world would be familiar with the face of Gerald Grant, who would often appear in the news and would be familiar with Gerald's secretary as well. The person who usually only appeared with Gerald on TV had arrived. The dean was shocked that Gerald paid attention to Bessy.
Miss Miller.
Secretary Peterson greeted Bessy first, very respectfully. Only then did he smile and turn to the dean. He handed a business card over to him.
Hello, Director Moore. I'm Mayor Grant's secretary. I'm here to deal with Miss Miller's affairs.
He smiled and shook hands with the dean. No one dared to speak, and the female teacher's face had long turned pale. Her appearance changed. A cold sweat broke on her forehead as she muttered.
Anne clearly told me that they didn't know each other.
Dean, if there's nothing else, I'll go back to class first. Bessy nodded to thank them and walked out. Nobody except Secretary Peterson dared to say a word. Grace had rushed over in anger after receiving Anne's phone call. She was now in a daze and could only stare at Bessy's back as she left the room. Then she turned to stare at Secretary Peterson, who was talking to the dean. Her head was buzzing as if this was the first time she saw Bessy. As everyone knows, things on Twitter should be subdued as soon and as calmly as possible. 3 days later, there wasn't a trace of Bessy's issue on Twitter, even when you input certain keywords. It was like a drop of water in the sea, unable to create any waves. Bessy had her stitches removed by Michael.
This is a piece of document.
Michael removed the stitches and asked her to pay attention to it before handing the information over to her. Since the Twitter issue was resolved, it was time to catch the mastermind. He didn't act out and left the matter to Bessy to resolve on her own. Of course, he was afraid she wouldn't handle it well. He had also asked Principal White at the same time. According to his degree of concern for Bessy, he certainly wouldn't sit back and ignore this matter. Bessy bit the lollipop in her mouth and looked down at the document. She also had a copy of this document, which was more detailed than the one Michael had just handed her.
Is it delicious?
Michael asked. Bessy looked up with misty and intoxicating eyes. What?
Your candy,
he said softly, pointing at the lollipop. Bessy took out another lollipop from her pocket and handed it to him. Eat it, don't worry, I have a lot. She didn't wear a jacket today and was wearing a plaid shirt that she had neglected for a long time. It was red and black, and the buttons were all buttoned up. Her shirt was stuffed into her jeans and her waist was very thin. The clear lines of her figure could be seen under the shirt she had tucked into her jeans. The sunlight bounced off the window and hit her face and dazzled slightly on her face. Michael smiled lazily and stared at it before taking out a cigarette and biting it, but he didn't light it. Marvin came in from outside with a mobile phone.
Michael, Harvey Dillard.
He was about to say something, but as soon as he saw Bessy, he swallowed his words and glanced at her subconsciously. The thread on Bessy's hand had been removed, and she stood up by supporting herself on the table. She heard Michael say,
"Just say it."
"Harvey Dillard has come to Chicago to find you. They're right outside." Marvin glanced at Bessy and said blankly, "The principal's office." Kenneth knocked on the door and entered. He said in a respectful voice,
"Grandpa, sit."
Principal White pointed to the chair by the door and closed the document in his hand.
"I heard you like a girl in school very much."
Kenneth seemed surprised.
"Grandpa, you're talking about Anne? She used your name and did something. Of course, it doesn't mean that your network can't be used."
Principal White tapped his finger on the table and was silent for a while. Then he continued,
"Grandpa just doesn't understand. Why didn't you raise a question on Bessy and yet found someone like that?"
Then Principal White pushed the document on the table over to Kenneth.
"Look at this."
Kenneth's hand paused and he reached over as if he was unaffected. The information that Principal White had been given to him by Samuel and was complete. Kenneth flipped over the pictures and his eyes drooped and turned cold. After a long wait, Principal White saw that Kenneth was silent. He took the cup of tea and took a sip.
"Do you have anything to say about Anne? Grandpa wants to hear your opinion."
Kenneth turned over the pictures and then put the document back. He looked up at Principal White and seemed to think for a while before saying in a respectful tone,
"Grandpa, why do you think I like her?"
Principal White had lived to this age and was usually good at discerning people, especially his grandson. Although he was outstanding, he was thoughtful and couldn't take after him. At this moment, he didn't expect Kenneth to give this answer and was a little surprised.
"You don't like her?" "Yes." "Then why did you disagree when I asked you to get engaged?"
"I never thought of getting married." Kenneth's eyes were clear, but they were still cold and calm. Principal White was silent for a long time. When he left the principal's office, Kenneth didn't carry the document. He didn't go downstairs and just stood at the end of the corridor, watching a group of teenagers playing basketball in the playground not far away. Fresh and bright, his grandpa, Paul, and the students of Bright Bow High School, and even Anne herself, seemed to think he really liked her. The Smith family's house.
"Aunt Ruth, go tidy up one room on the second floor,"
David instructed at the dinner table. Grace had been thinking about Bessy and Gerald for the past 2 days. She looked up in surprise at this.
"Is someone coming?" "It's Chloe Harper. She's also in her 4th year of high school and wants to come back to Chicago to take her college entrance examination."
David put down his fork.
"I only heard about this from Houston today."
The Harper family was on Thomas's grandfather's side. Thomas's mother died many years ago, but the contact between the two families never stopped. Their business center had relocated to Evanston in recent years. If Chloe hadn't been in the 12th grade this year, she wouldn't have come back. At the dinner table, Thomas and David discussed the matter. Anne was distracted. Several days had passed and Abigail had completely lost the news on Twitter's hot search engine. Anne couldn't reach the blogger again. Kenneth used to contact her to discuss his problems or listen to her playing the violin. She had always been detached from Kenneth, but now he was really behaving like this. She felt more uneasy. She had been distracted in class these past few days too. Anne sat on the chair, her long hair falling down her shoulders, covering her dark eyes. After a long while, she looked up. "Mom, I want to bring my sister over to Mr. Grint in Evanston too. You know, she played the violin before too." Grace was quite surprised.
"Bring her over?"
Anne nodded. David was almost done his dinner, but he didn't leave. He raised his eyebrow in surprise when he heard this.
"Have you talked it over with your aunt?"
"I will tell Aunt myself. She probably won't reject it." Anne smiled warmly. Grace naturally knew Elise's character. If Anne was to mention this, Elise might react with disgust. If it had been in the past, Grace would have never let Anne take the risk. But now, Grace remembered meeting the mayor's secretary a few days ago in the office and nodded in a sullen mood. Anne lowered her head and her doubts increased. In the afternoon, class had just ended. After Bessy removed her stitches, she was in a good mood. She was getting ready to go to the hospital to see Bertha when she received a call. It was from Grace. Bessy ignored it. However, Grace persisted. Bessy thought about it and picked up. Grace was afraid of bumping into an acquaintance and wouldn't bring Bessy outside for the time being, so she made an appointment with her at the Smith family's house at night.
"It's Miss Miller."
Aunt Ruth glanced up and down at her.
"Come in."
Bessy's right hand was in her pocket. Her eyes were narrowed, and she was too lazy to bother about her. Her eyes swept across the room. Grace was sitting on the sofa, somewhat absent-minded. Anne was coming downstairs. Bessy didn't sit and was still holding a roll of paper in her hand. Bessy stared at Anne for a moment and then looked away. She looked casually at Grace and said, "Why did you call me over?" Grace stood up, stared at Bessy and smiled.
"Bessy, you're here. Your hand."
Bessy was quite impatient. "No need to be modest with me. What's the matter?" Grace paused and was a little unhappy inside, but she still endured it.
"Your sister is going to Evanston in a month. Mr. Grint is very good, and I'm preparing for you to head over with her to broaden your knowledge."
Bessy tilted her head, and her hair fell across her forehead. Her eyes were cold, and the corner of her mouth was hooked sinisterly as she looked at Anne indifferently. "Go to Evanston? Are you sure she has such good intentions?" Grace was somewhat dissatisfied with her attitude.
"What do you mean? You don't have good grades. If you learn the violin, you can still take the art path. Your sister is doing this entirely for you."
"Sister, don't get me wrong. I just want good things for you. You also know that your studies—" Anne paused and then continued. "Mr. Grint is very famous. Even if he doesn't keep you as his disciple, you will still benefit greatly from his advice." Bessy sneered. She had always been like this, cold and mean. She always looked cold and evil when she looked at others. She wasn't as obedient and quiet as Anne. Grace was agitated by her expression.
"What's with your expression? Your sister is doing it for your sake." "What's the matter?"
At this time, David walked in and handed his briefcase to Aunt Ruth. His gaze swept across Grace and Anne and finally fell on Bessy. He smiled.
"Oh, Bessy is here."
He paused and then said,
"Why are you arguing?"
"Dad, it's okay. It was my fault. I made her angry." Anne pursed her lips and lowered her head so that her face couldn't be seen. David was stunned and he said in a gentle voice,
"Anne, talk nicely to your sister. She's not."
Bam! Episode 57, Number 1 Female Detective. Bessy raised her hand and threw a few sheets of paper on the table. She stared at Grace and said, "I have nothing to say. I just hope you can manage Anne better. Uncle David, you've helped me before, so I didn't hand this over to the court." Anne glanced at the papers on the table and felt uneasy. David didn't know about what had happened on Twitter recently. He raised his hand to pick up the papers on the table and flipped through it. His face turned solemn and his gentle expression became heavy. The above was the chat record of Anne contacting Abigail, as well as the chat record of her introducing the blogger to Abigail. The last one was the bank transfer proof of Anne transferring $400,000 to Abigail. David understood the situation after looking at the files. "Uncle David, look at it first. I'll head back to school." Bessy saw David was almost done with the document and said to him before she turned and walked outside. Perhaps it was because of the atmosphere, but David wasn't as gentle as before. Anne didn't dare to speak. David asked the driver to send Bessy back to school, but his offer was rejected, so he sent her to the door. When he came back, his face was solemn and his eyes were cold.
"This was what Bessy just gave me. Take a look."
David handed the sheets of paper to Grace. Grace looked at it, and her heart tightened instantly. Anne felt more and more uneasy, and her heart started pounding. She approached the paper in Grace's hand and looked through it. The records of her chat with Abigail, the blogger, and a record of her bank transfer to Abigail were all printed clearly. The blood in Anne's face drained instantly, and the veins on her neck bulged. She had thought of Bessy as an ordinary high school student, so she hadn't used a fake identity when she introduced Abigail to the blogger. Who knew that these chat records and even the bank transfer records would appear in Grace's hands? When did she have such big abilities? Father, Mother, that's not the case. Anne embraced David's arm, her eyes quickly misting. Abigail is my friend. I didn't know that she asked me to supervise Twitter for this. And she's about to leave Brightbow High School, so how could I not lend her money when she asked? The panic in Anne's heart burst instantly when she felt David didn't relax. David lowered his head and glanced at her.
Abigail is your friend, but you lent her $400,000 without asking? How did she know you were familiar with the blogger?
Anne was a bit stiff and blurted. They all know that I'm close to the blogger. Dad, you also know I only sleep 5 or 6 hours after practicing the violin. When would I have the time for this? David glanced at her. Then he reached out to remove her hand and turned to head upstairs. He massaged his eyebrows and seemed tired.
Anne, let me think about it.
Downstairs, Anne didn't dare to follow him. She just collapsed on the sofa, her eyes trembling. Grace ignored her and just sat down after throwing the sheets of paper all over the table. A few days later, there is a Jeep from Evanston parked next to the school doctor's office. A tall man of about 30 years old got out of the front passenger seat. He had extremely prominent facial features, sharp eyes, cold and thin lips, and a beard emerging from his chin. He is clearly a tough guy. He gave the school doctor's office a few glances. Then he pushed open the door to enter. Bessy's right hand was almost healed, but there was still a slowly fading scar. Michael was giving her medicine. It was a pale green ointment that Bessy had never seen before. It felt cool on her wound.
Mr. Clark, about...
The man in his 30s came in while holding a stack of files in his hand. Before he finished, he saw the girl sitting opposite Michael and stopped. Obviously, ordinary people shouldn't know about this matter. Bessy kept the medicine and naturally excused herself. Michael leaned back and said casually,
Wait for dinner. Sit. This is Harvey Dillard, the prominent leader of Evanston's criminal investigation team.
He turned to look at the man and drawled,
Just say it.
Harvey Dillard paused and then stared at Bessy for a while. Her eyebrows were lowered and she had thin fingers tapping her lips. Her facial features were exquisite and bright, and she seemed a little cold. This expression was rare. He froze for a while and then said a few words to Michael. He still avoided Bessy and said little. After a while, Marvin, Samuel, and Freddie returned. They were all quite happy to see Harvey Dillard.
Harvey!
Samuel went to pat him on the shoulder brotherly. Marvin and Freddie were very serious and respectful.
Harvey!
These two were obviously extremely respectful to Harvey. Harvey cast a doubtful look at Marvin, signaling at Bessy. Marvin shook his head blankly. He laid out the meals. During the meal, Samuel rambled on aimlessly.
Harvey, is my goddess here yet?
Marvin looked at Harvey expectantly. Harvey shook his head.
She has something to do and can't leave Evanston. Oh.
Marvin was disappointed.
This case would be much easier to solve if my goddess was here.
Harvey nodded, but because Bessy was here, he just said vaguely,
Yes, this case isn't easy to solve. It's similar to case 712 from 3 years ago. If I can find the person who managed the case, I'm 90% confident that I can catch them.
Harvey seemed to know some insider stories. Samuel supported his chin in doubt. Harvey Dillard was the number one in the criminal investigation team, and he rarely saw him so subdued. Thus, he was surprised.
Harvey, you can be subdued by someone too? The person from 712.
Harvey finished eating and put down his fork. He wanted to say something, but when he saw Bessy sitting on the side, he swallowed and intoned.
It's nothing.
Bessy kept her head lowered. While Harvey Dillard was talking, she picked up her rice with her fork.
What's wrong?
Michael lowered his head. Nothing. Bessy shook her head. After dinner, Harvey called Marvin out alone.
Who is that girl?
Harvey lit a cigarette for himself and narrowed his eyes slightly.
A Brightbow High School student.
Marvin was expressionless. Harvey huffed a ring of smoke and narrowed his eyes.
A student? You're doubtful too, right?
Marvin was extremely calm and undulated.
She's not only a student, but her studies are also bad. Of course, she's very good-looking, better than your goddess.
Marvin had always been quite proud, and Harvey had never seen him behave like this to anyone. So he was a little curious if this girl was unique.
How could she compare to my goddess? My goddess is the #1 female detective on the criminal investigation team.
Harvey turned and glanced at Marvin before nodding.
Oh.
He wasn't interested anymore and stopped asking.
I read the file from 3 years ago.
Harvey turned and walked out.
I went to Chicago's criminal investigation team.
A few days later, the scars on Bessy's hand were almost healed. Recently, Michael, Samuel, and the others were busy. Harvey Dillard guarded her like a wolf, and Bessy rarely went to the school doctor's office. She laid on the table with her eyes slightly closed. Her school jacket was pulled up to cover her chin. Beside her, Mary was explaining a question to Riley.
Mary, where did you get this notebook from?
Riley pointed to the notebook that Mary had been referring to and asked. Mary turned and glanced at her. Bessy gave it to me, but she seldom looked at it. I feel like the name is so familiar. Riley pointed to the 3 smooth words on the first page thoughtfully. Mary smiled and wasn't bothered by this. There are so many people in the world. Hundreds of people in the nation could have this name. It was nothing strange. But Riley shook her head. I've definitely seen it before. Riley was so adamant about it, so Mary couldn't help but pick up the notebook and turn over a few chapters. The words were written with intent, and it clearly explained every point. The focus was also very clear. It fascinated Mary, and she only returned to her senses when the afternoon self-study was over. Bessy, where did you get the notebook from? Mary finally realized that Bessy had given her a treasure. Someone gave it to me. Bessy blinked and looked at Mary with her eyes squinted casually. Her eyebrows were lazy and smooth. Mary knew Bessy quite well and didn't ask more. Instead, she copied Bessy, laid on the table and talked about something else. Bessy, it's the school's anniversary in a few days. Our class has organized a program. Do you want to? In fact, this program had already begun since school started. It was the 50th anniversary, so the school attached great importance to it. At that time, Bessy hadn't transferred to English class yet. After Bessy turned around, she was a little cold and amused. She was good-looking, but the entertainment committee didn't dare to ask her. Until a few days ago, when they finally relented and asked Mary to be the middlewoman. Before Mary even said anything, Bessy put a book on her head and said in a dull voice, I reject. Mary looked at her face in distress and said she was too arrogant. Bessy put on her headphones. She was too noisy. After school in the afternoon, Bessy and Mary went downstairs together. She always left late. She just got out of school when the same old man wearing a suit stopped her again. His attitude was tough and persistent.
Miss Miller, Mrs. Grant is looking for you.
This time, there were 2 bodyguards wearing black clothes behind him. Not far away, students cast doubtful glances over at them. Bessy took a deep breath. Fine, I'll go with you. 5 minutes later, in a room close to the school, Mrs. Grant was sitting by the window, looking at the girl sitting opposite with a steely face.
You're the female student that Gerald pushed away all his work to see at night?
Mrs. Grant held the teacup in her hand elegantly, but her stare was full of thorns and ridicule. Bessy sat opposite her expressionlessly. Although she had always been cold, she was mostly casual and careless, with the frivolity of it being a game. Her delicate face was expressionless at that moment, and her eyes were deep and hazy. You hid deep enough. Mrs. Grant threw the teacup on the table with a bam. Should I say that you're highly skilled? What do you want? Bessy took a deep breath. Her voice undulated. But her eyes looked heavy, hot and dry. Leave Chicago. Mrs. Grant glanced at her. Don't try to find Gerald in vain. You're a student and can't compete against me." Bessy smiled coolly. Her hand tightened around the cup and she said, "Mrs. Grant, you're always like this, dominant and willful. You have no care for anyone's life." She lowered her eyes and almost smashed her cup at the person in front of her. But at that time, her cell phone rang. It was a melodious sound. Bessy looked down. It was the alarm clock Michael had set for her, and there was a note on it. "Apply the green bottle of ointment." It calmed her violent outburst a little. Bessy took a deep breath. She took out her mobile phone and dialed a number. "Uncle Grant, come over to Orlando's coffee shop." Episode 60. Best doctor in the medical field. Bessy couldn't be bothered with Harvey. She simply rolled up her sleeves and said, That was the response she gave Samuel.
"Harvey."
Samuel had always been protective of Bessy, but this time it was urgent and he didn't have time to say more. He simply shot Harvey a warning look and left after letting Bessy know. Outside, Bessy placed the book back on the table and took her keys with her anyway. A half-hour later, she arrived at the hospital. There seemed to be more people than normal here today. There was even a fleet of luxury cars at the entrance. Several people gathered around taking pictures and uploading them to social media platforms. Bessy walked into Bertha's ward. Andrea and Susan were already there for a visit.
"I've been better these past few days. You guys don't have to come and see me so often."
Bertha glanced at Bessy. Bessy pared an apple for Bertha by her bedside. "Who came yesterday?" she asked quietly when she saw the tulips at the bedside table. Bessy handed the pared and diced apples to Bertha.
"It was Thomas. He comes over whenever he's free. He's a good boy, always making me happy."
Bertha smiled kindly as she brought his name up. "He seems more filial than that biological granddaughter of yours." Bessy cleared her throat. Ever since Bertha was hospitalized, Anne hasn't paid a visit, even once. Bessy had always been direct with her words, and Bertha did not tell her off this time either. She simply smiled. Susan tugged at Bessy's sleeves and whispered, "Cousin, it isn't nice to talk about second cousin this way. She's busy practicing her violin." Susan did not dare to say any more when she saw Bessy's frosty glare and quickly switched topics. "Cousin, did you see those cars when you were coming up? I don't recognize the brands, but they looked so intimidating." She sounded envious. Bessy simply shrugged and said she didn't know about it. Susan was only asking casually. She wasn't expecting Bessy to recognize them either. But she heard some people discussing downstairs, saying that the most of the cars were limited edition luxury models. "I heard there are big shots around today. We might get to see them if we hang out a little longer." Bessy paid little attention to it. After visiting Bertha, she went to look for Bertha's doctor in charge before going to Michael. Michael's cell phone was switched off, but he told Bessy that he had to perform surgery before he left. Bessy was pretty sharp with her judgment. She was pretty sure that most of the luxury cars downstairs were there because of him. In that case, Bessy roughly knew of his position. There was a VIP ward on the 29th floor with an isolated operating room. There were several security officers on that floor now, but Bessy could simply get a nurse's jacket and find her way in there. Yet, she did not. She simply waited by the elevator. Beside her, there was also a group of successful men in custom-made suits and office bags, each with a personal assistant. As a young girl, she already stood out amongst them. Michael's surgery ended pretty early, so Bessy did not have to wait very long. When the elevator doors opened, she saw a man emerge from among a crowd of doctors. At the same time, the group of successful men huddled forwards towards the elevator. Michael trailed behind the hospital's director. He was in a white doctor's coat, and the surgical mask was still hanging on one ear. He unbuttoned his coat with one hand, calmly and professionally. Even after hours of surgery, he did not seem the least bit exhausted. Crowded as it was, everyone maintained at least a 6-foot distance from him, and they'd subconsciously lowered their voices too. It was a quiet scene.
The next surgery depends on the situation.
His voice was slightly hoarse from the long hours without water. He received a pen from the director and was ready to go to the meeting room for a research discussion. But when he looked up, he caught sight of a cold figure at the corner, against the wall. Michael stopped in his tracks. The creme de la creme of the financial industry, and the director intuitively stopped by his side as well. Michael was a renowned doctor in his field. A veteran cardiologist had even openly said that he was a natural talent, born to be a doctor. By right, one would expect that rich, scheming people would long have used him for their benefit. Oddly enough, no one had dared approach him for such reasons before. Even those big shots from the financial industry were very respectful to him. Nobody in the medical field knew his backing, his identity, or background. Even the most successful of bosses had to be respectful towards Michael. Michael was always very focused during surgeries, and he kept his cell phone off. After the surgeries, he would also set aside a few hours to guide the accompanying doctors. Without fail, those who knew him were therefore very shocked when he took his coat off and spoke to the girl so gently. Most of them stood by, watching in confusion. Bessy got straight to the point and told him about Marvin.
I got it.
Michael took his cell phone out while informing the director of the hospital. He then took Bessy along and walked out, his eyes hard with intention. He did not care that he left a group of people in utter shock behind him. After giving Samuel a call, he turned to Bessy.
Wait here for me. I'll get the car.
Bessy did not intend to go, since Harvey did not really seem to like her anyway. It wasn't just dislike. He despised her. But seeing that Michael rushed to get the car, she did not want to say much. Michael drove over a while later.
Get in first.
It wasn't the black car she was familiar with, but a blue Lamborghini.
Marvin drove my car away yesterday. Rick sent this over at the last minute, but its function isn't as good. It can't go up mountainous roads.
Michael explained. Bessy did not respond. On the other side, Susan was ready to leave after visiting Bertha. She had just stepped out of the entrance when she noticed the stylish luxury car parked by the road. She stole a few more glances at it because it was so eye-catching. Then she overheard a few men saying that this car was a limited edition. Its price was upwards of $10 million. Susan would never have expected that sort of astronomical sum. She thought that Anne's violin, worth $5,000, was already the limit. But the next moment, she saw Bessy getting into the front passenger seat. "Cousin!" Susan immediately called out to her. Bessy was planning to get into the car swiftly, but Susan had appeared and was jogging towards her. Bessy furrowed her brows. "Cousin, what are you doing here? Is this your friend?" Susan was speaking to Bessy, but she couldn't help but direct her vision to the car instead. The Lamborghini's windows were so tinted she wasn't able to see the driver's face, but she could see the pair of hands on the steering wheel, slender and beautiful. She could tell that the driver wasn't an old person. Susan tried to look further in. "I've something on," Bessy said succinctly. "I'll go first." "But, cousin..." Susan didn't want Bessy to leave just yet. She looked towards the sports car with unbridled interest. Michael casually said,
"Bessy, it's time to go."
Bessy nodded at Susan and then got into the car. There was no way she could see the driver from her point of view, so she could only watch as the car left. Chicago wasn't big. If there wasn't any traffic congestion, an hour was all it took to get from north to south. Michael reached the destination quicker than expected. Samuel and Harvey were waiting in the lounge.
"What's going on in here?"
Michael asked as he entered. Harvey and Samuel saw Michael enter and hurriedly said,
"Regarding Marvin's matters, Captain Gomez suggested we call the police and refused to say more. Samuel and I are waiting for him to knock off now."
Harvey was waiting for news about Marvin as well. After all, Harvey wasn't a local Chicago resident, and he wasn't able to intervene much here, but he knew that Marvin's disappearance couldn't be that simple. There would not be a point in calling the police. He was speaking when he saw Bessy enter discreetly behind Michael. She was playing games on her cell phone, unwilling to interfere. Bessy came in with Michael, and Harvey did not dare tell her off in front of him. He simply gave her a disdainful look.
Harvey, someone sent you this.
There was a knock on the door before a man came in and handed Harvey an old jigsaw puzzle. It was in a mess. Bessy hadn't played her game in days, and she was waiting for it to refresh when she glanced at that old puzzle. It wasn't anything complicated. It would probably be a picture of a pet dog when it was completed. She looked away. Harvey furrowed his brows.
Why would someone give me this for no reason?
Michael eyed the jigsaw puzzle and tilted his head. He asked Samuel,
Are there any old factories here in Chicago? One that manufactures plastic. I'm not sure. I'll have to ask Rick.
Samuel took out his cell phone.
Michael, anything else you can decipher?
Harvey knew that this was likely sent by the person who took Marvin away and hurriedly passed it over to Michael. Michael placed the puzzle on the table and pieced it together. It wasn't a complete set. There were missing pieces here and there. Michael looked at it for a while. Then, 2 people came into the lounge. He warned Bessy in a mellow voice. The technical personnel were trying to track down the location. But the location he found was exactly where they were at. Samuel widened his eyes.
How could this be? There's too much interference.
The technical personnel sounded serious.
It would take about a day to get everything figured out from scratch.
For such a huge project, a day was considered pretty fast.
But your case 712 was really fast.
Harvey looked straight at Captain Gomez and the technical personnel. Captain Gomez did not say a thing. Bessy kept her phone and stood up. Michael turned towards Bessy and handed the technical personnel laptop to her. He smiled and said,
For you.
Bessy looked at Michael in surprise. She didn't expect Michael to hand her the laptop right away. Captain Gomez was a serious and cold person. Even after Harvey said so many words to him, he didn't utter a reply. Harvey learned of how cold the people in this team were in the past few days. Captain Gomez didn't even care about him, despite his persistence in the past few days. He finally appeared today, perhaps because Michael was here. Harvey was about to ask the technical personnel some questions. However, he saw Michael handing over the laptop to Bessy and frowned.
Michael, why are you giving the laptop to her? Don't hold up the programmer's work.
He then looked unhappily at Bessy, as if asking why wasn't she leaving yet. Samuel didn't react in time. He tilted his head and seemed deep in thought about Michael's intentions. Bessy looked at the laptop in Michael's hands and took it from him. Before she turned around, the technical personnel hurriedly stood up and made way for her. Bessy sat down and concentrated on her work. She pursed her lips as her slender fingers tapped away on the keyboard. Lines and lines of code that only programmers understood appeared on the screen. Locate it, Bessy said nonchalantly. The surrounding atmosphere changed once she started concentrating. The technical staff, who was very cold to Harvey, heard her and took out a cell phone from his pocket. He flipped it open and clicked on a switch on the left side. It then immediately turned into a mini computer.
Locating.
The technical staff sat by her side and opened up the map. Following Bessy's instruction, he found an address in the north part of the city. Everyone saw how the technical personnel went through a ton of code and information during his testing, and still ended up with nothing. Not even 10 minutes had passed, and she'd found the location? What the heck? Who was she? Harvey's jaw dropped. He went from puzzled to surprised to numb. He thought he was hallucinating. Captain Gomez brought a cup of tea and placed it beside Bessy's right hand.
This is green tea. I have used 7 tea leaves. It's not too strong.
He then turned towards Harvey.
I've sent people to the abandoned factory in the north.
Harvey was completely speechless now. Samuel recovered from the initial surprise. However, he couldn't stop himself from looking at Bessy again and again.
Michael, you knew this all along?
Samuel finally found his voice again. Clenching his fists and placing it onto his lips, Michael coughed lightly.
I had prior suspicion, but only came to a conclusion now.
Michael felt like there was something wrong when traces of Bessy were found in 712. He then found out more from the cryptographic codes. He confirmed his suspicions when Captain Gomez suddenly appeared.
Captain Gomez shouldn't have heard of me before. From what you guys have told me, he didn't appear even after Harvey visited him so many times. That meant that he didn't want to be involved.
Samuel was puzzled.
But that's just a guess. After Captain Gomez came, his eyes kept shifting to her. This was his subconscious at play. From his expressions, he holds her in high regard.
712?
Samuel was more puzzled. That was 3 years ago. How old is she?
Michael didn't reply.
Heck, you guys are all crazy good at this.
After a long while, Samuel finally snapped back to his senses. He wiped his face and said emotionlessly, both the technical personnel and Captain Gomez, who were very cold to Harvey, gathered around Bessy. Samuel didn't want to interrupt, but didn't dare to talk to Michael as well. He could only pat Harvey on the shoulder.
Actually, Captain Gomez isn't so cold. Look at how enthusiastic he is to Bessy, bringing tea and water, treating her like her dad.
Harvey was speechless.
Say something.
Samuel shook his shoulders. He was choking in the silence. He would explode if no one talked to him. Harvey remained silent. What the heck was there to say? Marvin's address was out. Harvey looked at Bessy deeply and proceeded with Samuel to save Marvin. Bessy was surrounded by the people in the station. Michael stood at one side and saw how the technical personnel was looking at Bessy with admiration. The surrounding crowd was asking many questions, trapping her in. Samuel and Harvey had left. Michael tapped on his phone with his fingers and squinted at them. Those surrounding Bessy heard a soft voice.
Don't you have exam papers to finish?
Bessy felt a slight headache from the noise surrounding her. She couldn't think clearly. Michael's soft voice felt gentle to her ears. She identified it easily. Bessy's mind seemed to have found an answer as she rushed out from the surrounding crowd. She then said towards the crowd behind her, "That's right, I still have exam papers to finish. The teacher is waiting to check it." Bessy heaved a sigh of relief and mumbled, "Let's go back." Michael looked down at her. Seeing her relaxed expression, he chuckled lightly.
All right, let's go back.
Acting as if nothing had happened, he turned around and exited the doors nonchalantly. However, he intentionally slowed down. By the time Harvey and the others rescued Marvin, it was already 2 hours later, at 5 p.m. As Harvey and Samuel had to proceed for handover, Marvin didn't return with Samuel. Instead, he took Captain Gomez's car back to the school doctor's office. After arriving at the school doctor's office, he saw Harvey and Samuel coming after recording the data.
I thought I wouldn't see y'all for a couple more days,
Marvin said emotionally after seeing them.
How did Captain Gomez agree to help? And how did y'all find me? I asked Captain Gomez, but he didn't reply at all. He's such a distant person.
Marvin wanted to continue, but then, from the corner of his eyes, he saw Bessy getting a cup of water from the kitchen. He stopped and didn't continue in front of her. Bessy took a sip of water and glared at him. It did not bother her as she sat back in her chair and continued doing her practice papers casually, with one hand supporting her chin. Marvin glared at her and frowned. Looking at Harvey and Samuel, he whispered,
"Let's talk outside."
Before he could finish, Harvey cut him off emotionlessly.
"There's no need for that." "What? We don't have to talk outside or avoid her,"
Harvey said while staring at Bessy.
"She saved your life."
Marvin was speechless. He was quite emotional just now. He avoided Bessy whenever he spoke, but this time, he was silent. This time, Samuel completely ignored Marvin. He walked directly to Bessy's table and placed his hands on the table. He did not speak. Instead, he stared at her as if it was the first time he saw her. A moment later, Marvin looked at Harvey numbly. He felt as if there was something wrong with his ears.
"Harvey, didn't you save me with Captain Gomez and the others? The situation was complicated. Your location was uncertain, and the technicians could not determine your specific location."
Harvey succinctly explained.
"It was her computer that determined your location. Otherwise, you would not have been saved by now."
So, it was not wrong to say that Bessy saved Marvin.
All Captain Gomez's technicians could not figure out my location, and she's the one who did it in the end?
Marvin had a hard time summarizing the situation. Yes. Although he had experienced the situation and tried to recall what happened again, Harvey still found it hard to believe. He clenched his fist before saying,
It wasn't even half an hour.
Marvin stopped talking.